Have you ever wondered how humans survived a world that seemed designed to erase them? A time when ice buried continents, winds swept across empty plains, and one failed hunt could mean the end of an entire family line. And yet, somehow, we remained. Tonight, we step into the coldest period our species ever endured, to uncover how fragile human beings survived a planet of ice, hunger, and silence. If you enjoy deep history and ancient mysteries like this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. The cold does not arrive like a storm. It settles over the world so completely that whole continents begin to forget what warmth feels like. The North is buried under ice so vast it creates its own geography, its own weather, its own silence. Glaciers spread over Europe and North America in walls and domes thousands of meters thick. Winds sweep across open plains with nothing to stop them. Sea levels fall so far that coastlines retreat by distances no living person today would recognize, exposing raw land where waves once moved. Forests shrink back, deserts expand in some places, while in others dry. Treeless grasslands stretch under a pale sky for what seems like the length of the earth itself. It is a world of frozen margins, hard light, and long hunger. And somewhere inside it, against all reasonable expectation, human beings remain. Not comfortably, not easily, not in numbers that make the outcome feel safe, but they remain. That is the mystery at the center of this landscape. Human beings are tropical in their deep design. The body is built from a lineage that begins in warmth, bare skin, sweating for cooling, long limbs in many populations. A metabolism forever balancing energy against risk. None of this suggests a creature meant to thrive where winter can kill in a single night, and where one failed hunt may mean the end of a family line. Yet during the coldest stretch of the last ice age, when the planet seems to narrow into a chain of habitable refuges and bitter open corridors, our species does not vanish. It persists, adapts, spreads, and in time outlasts every other human form still sharing the world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, to imagine the coldest period humans somehow live through, it helps to step away from the tidy maps of the present. The planet of the last glacial maximum, around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, is familiar only in outline. The oceans still occupy their basins, the great mountain chains still rise, and the continents are where they should be. But everything else feels altered, stripped down, shifted towards severity. Northern Europe lies close to immense ice sheets. Much of Britain is either glaciated or shaped by periglacial cold so intense that the ground itself fractures and creeps. Farther east, huge regions of Eurasia become dry, open, and windy, their vegetation pressed into forms that can tolerate cold and limited moisture. In North America, ice masses dominate the north, while broad southern margins become zones of unstable possibility. Even the tropics are affected. The Ice Age is not simply a story of snow. It is a story of colder temperatures. Yes, but also of weakened rainfall, changing seasonality, altered ocean circulation, expanding dust, and ecosystems reorganized from the roots up. The numbers alone are deceptive. Average global temperatures during the coldest phase are likely only several degrees lower than those of the pre-industrial world. But averages conceal what matters. Regional winters are brutal. Growing seasons contract. Storm tracks shift. Moisture becomes unreliable. The difference between life and death is not an abstract planetary mean. but what happens at ground level, how often a river freezes, whether fuel can be gathered, whether prey animals migrate through this valley or another, whether children can survive the night, whether skin cracks, lungs burn, and fat reserves hold until the next success. Scholars still debate the exact severity of conditions in different regions and seasons, because the evidence remains incomplete, and climate is never experienced as a single number. What survives in the record suggests a world not uniformly frozen, but fractured into zones of danger and opportunity, where local knowledge matters more than any general rule. In such a world, human existence becomes intensely geographical. A ridge that blocks wind can matter more than 1,000 square kilometers of empty steppe. A cave mouth facing the right direction can become a seasonal anchor for generations. A stand of scrub or dwarf willow, insignificant in warmer ages, may mean fuel, bedding, material for hafting, smoke for preserving meat, and a chance to keep fire through a week of punishing weather. The cold compresses life into pockets. It punishes waste. It turns mistakes into graves, and still, people learn to live inside it with a competence so complete that the archaeological traces can seem almost understated. A scatter of bones, a hearth, stone blades, a few worked antlers, an ivory bead, a stain in the ground where a structure once stood. From such thin remains emerges the outline of one of the most remarkable survival stories in human history. At first glance, the scene seems almost wrong for a human narrative. This is the age of mammoths crossing open country under a vast sky, of woolly rhinoceroses and reindeer herds moving through cold grasslands, of foxes in winter coats, of steppe bison, saiga, horses, cave lions, and scavengers following the margins of death. It is a world of big animals and big distances, where survival depends not on dominating nature in any modern sense, but on fitting into rhythms already in motion. People do not control this landscape. They read it. They anticipate it. They trail the edges of migration routes, river valleys, and sheltered basins. They learn where snow lies shallow, where animals funnel, where fish remain available, where stone can be found, where spring arrives first, where the dead can be buried without the ground defeating the effort completely. The oldest image many people carry of Ice Age humanity is crude and misleading, a half-starved figure wrapped in skins, stumbling through snow behind a spear. The reality is more demanding and more impressive. These are not merely desperate survivors. They are experts in hostile environments. They shape stone with precision, tailor clothing with bone needles in some regions and periods, construct shelters from wood, hide, and bone where caves are absent, and manage fire under conditions where fire is not a convenience, but a boundary between life and extinction. Their social worlds must be equally sophisticated. No single person survives long alone in this kind of cold. Knowledge must be transmitted. Food must be shared often enough to carry the unlucky through the dangerous gaps. Injuries must be tolerated by the group. Children must be protected through years of dependence. Older people, if they survive, may hold seasonal memory that is more valuable than strength. Somewhere in these frozen landscapes, stories are told not for entertainment alone, but as storage devices for the world where game crossed in the bad winter, where the river opened first, which valley trapped cold air, which plants could still be found after frost, what signs meant the herd had changed direction. And yet endurance does not mean security. That is what makes this period so haunting. Survival is real, but it is never guaranteed. Populations are likely sparse across enormous regions. Some territories may be abandoned for long stretches. Some groups disappear without leaving a clear explanation, absorbed, displaced, or simply erased by conditions too severe to forgive a run of bad seasons. Ancient DNA and archaeological patterns hint that human prehistory is full of contractions, expansions, disappearances, and replacements. The farther back the record goes, the less complete it becomes. No single explanation fully accounts for how all groups navigate the cold, because they do not all succeed in the same way or at the same time. Some endure in refuges comparatively milder zones where water, game, and plant resources remain available. Others push into severe environments with strategies we're only beginning to understand. Some paths open only because the sea has retreated. Others close because ice or drought makes a familiar route unlivable. The emotional texture of this age is harder to recover, but it matters. Imagine morning in a camp at the edge of a frozen plain. The air hurts immediately. Ash from the night fire must be checked for hidden heat. Tools are stiff with cold. Hides have frozen at the edges. Breath hangs and vanishes. Beyond the shelter, the landscape is wide and exposed, beautiful in a way that offers no kindness at all. The horizon seems permanent, but everything in it is moving on timescales humans must learn to follow: snow cover, wind direction, river ice, herd routes, the availability of dry fuel, the length of daylight. Fear is part of this world, but so is routine. The people who live here are not constantly astonished by the cold. They are occupied by it. They organize themselves within it. They develop habits so dependable that the extraordinary becomes ordinary. That, more than heroics, is how survival usually works. There is also a deeper irony at work. The very cold that makes life difficult also rearranges the planet in ways that sometimes favor movement. Lower sea levels expose land bridges. Dry steppe expands across areas that in warmer times would be broken by forest or water. New corridors appear, though they are harsh and risky. A planet under climatic stress becomes, in certain regions, more traversable for those able to endure it. Human beings are not passive victims of this transformation. They use it. They enter spaces opened by falling seas and shifting ecosystems. They follow prey into new lands. They discover that what looks like the edge of the world is sometimes a road. Still, the story must begin with restraint, because the temptation is to turn Ice Age survival into myth. It was not a triumph in any simple sense. It was costly. It depended on bodies under constant pressure, on infant mortality we can scarcely imagine, on injury and infection, on hunger, on the mathematics of small groups where every loss mattered. The cold strips away abundance. It exposes how thin the margin of survival can be. It also exposes something else: the unusual flexibility of Homo sapiens. Not the strength of claws or fur or massive size, but the strange advantage of cooperation, memory, portable technology, and behavior that can change faster than anatomy. Humans do not evolve into Arctic beasts in the span of the Ice Age. They do something less dramatic and more consequential. They improvise culture at a speed the cold cannot match. That is why this period remains so compelling. It is not only a climate story, or a story about ice sheets, extinct animals, and vanished worlds. It is a test of what kind of creature survives not because the world is kind, but because it is not. A warmer, richer landscape can hide weakness. A frozen one cannot. The coldest period humans somehow live through reveals our species in hard outline. Reduce warmth, shorten seasons, scatter resources, lower populations, widen distances. And still people persist. They sow, hunt, share. migrate, remember, and bury their dead. They make ornaments in bitter climates where beauty seems like a luxury and yet appears anyway. They leave marks of symbolism, planning, and attachment in a world that would seem to demand only brutal practicality. That may be the most surprising detail of all. Even here, in one of the least forgiving chapters of recent Earth history, human life is not reduced to bare survival alone. And so the white silence is never truly empty. Beneath the grinding ice, beyond the wind-carved plains, near rivers running under dim skies, in caves lit by uncertain fire, and in shelters built from whatever the land will spare, there are people. They are cold, often hungry, sometimes moving, sometimes waiting. They are fragile in the way all humans are fragile, but they are also already recognizably us. Not because they live as we do, but because the essentials are present foresight, dependence on one another, technical skill, and the stubborn refusal to yield the world entirely to fear. The Ice Age presses down with a force that reshapes continents. Human beings answer not with power on the same scale, but with persistence measured in nights survived, winters endured, and generations carried forward through a landscape that gives almost nothing freely. The deeper story begins there, with a frozen planet that seems designed to exclude us, and with small bands of people who remain anyway. To understand how they do it, the cold itself has to be understood first, not just as weather, but as a world-making force, one that redraws shorelines, rewrites ecosystems, and creates the severe stage on which this long survival unfolds. The cold is not a single event. It is a long decision made by the planet in increments so small, no human lifetime can fully witness it, but cumulative enough to transform oceans, winds, mountains, and the fate of species. By the time people are living inside the harshest phase of the last ice age, the process behind that frozen world has already been unfolding for many thousands of years. Snow has fallen and failed to melt, then fallen again. Ice has thickened not in a season, but generation after generation, until pressure turns layers into glacial mass and glacial mass into something with a life of its own. It flows, slowly but irresistibly, carving valleys, burying landscapes, redirecting rivers, and changing the atmosphere above it. The world grows colder not only because there is more ice, but because the ice begins to reorganize the whole system around itself. At the broader scale, the story starts with the rhythms of Earth's orbit and tilt, the slow astronomical variations that alter how sunlight is distributed across the planet. These cycles do not switch an ice age on like a lamp. They change the odds. They make northern summers slightly cooler at crucial times, and that matters more than winter cold. Winter snow can fall in abundance, but if summers are warm enough, it vanishes. When summers weaken, snow survives. And surviving snow becomes the seed of ice. Over long spans, that small seasonal imbalance accumulates. More bright ice means more sunlight reflected back into space. More reflection means less absorbed warmth. Cooler conditions allow more ice to persist, which cools things further still. What begins as a subtle orbital nudge can become a planetary feedback loop. But orbital cycles alone do not explain the full severity of glacial climates. The Earth system is too complicated, too alive with interacting parts. Oceans transport heat across enormous distances, and when temperature, salinity, or wind patterns shift, currents can weaken, intensify, or change route. Sea ice expands and contracts, altering the exchange of moisture and heat between water and air. Atmospheric circulation reorganizes around new temperature gradients. Dust becomes more abundant in colder, drier worlds, changing the reflectivity of surfaces and perhaps influencing cloud formation and marine productivity. Greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide and methane, decline during glacial phases, reinforcing the cooling. Scholars still debate the precise timing and weight of some of these mechanisms because no single explanation fully accounts for every turn in the climate record. What survives in ice cores, marine sediments, cave deposits, and pollen sequences suggests a system of interlocking effects, not a simple chain of cause and consequence. To a human observer standing anywhere within that process, the transformation would not look global at first. It would look local and erratic. Springs arriving late, winters lingering, tree lines pulling back up slope or southward, wet places drying, familiar herds shifting their routes, a valley that once supported woodland becoming open steppe, marshes shrinking, lakes changing depth or vanishing entirely, a coastline creeping outward as the sea retreats, stronger winds lifting more dust from bare ground, rivers fed by glacial melt swelling in some seasons and faltering in others. The advance of a cold age is not a smooth descent into white silence. It is a mosaic of pressures, some sudden, some gradual, some temporary, some irreversible on human timescales. This matters because people do not experience climate as charts. They experience it as a changing pattern of opportunities and risks. In the higher latitudes, however, the large pattern eventually becomes unmistakable. Ice sheets begin as persistent accumulations and grow into continental presences. In North America, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets expand over vast northern regions. In northern Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet spreads across Scandinavia and beyond. These are not mountain glaciers in isolated valleys. They are broad ice domes, kilometers thick in places, heavy enough to press the crust downward beneath them. Their margins become dynamic frontiers of meltwater, rock debris, unstable ground, and raw cold. Their surfaces generate katabatic winds, dense streams of frigid air flowing downward under gravity, capable of intensifying already hostile conditions at their edges. South of the actual ice lies another world almost as important, the periglacial zone, where repeated freezing and thawing shatter rock, churn soil, and make the land itself unstable. Much of Ice Age hardship happens not on the ice, but in these marginal belts where life is still possible and never secure. As ice grows, sea level falls. Water locked in glaciers no longer circulates freely through the oceans, and the effect is enormous. At the last glacial maximum, sea levels stand more than 100 meters lower than today. Continental shelves emerge as land. Coasts move outward. Islands become peninsulas or disappear into larger land masses. Shallow seas contract. The geography people inherit is therefore not simply colder but redrawn. The North Sea basin is partly exposed. Southeast Asia is transformed by the joining of islands into the larger landmass known as Sunderland. To the northeast, Beringia links Siberia and Alaska across a wide plain, not a narrow bridge but an entire region. These changes will later matter profoundly for migration, but they begin as one consequence among many of a colder world, the planet storing water in frozen form and revealing land that had long been hidden. The paradox of glacial climates is that a colder world is not always a snowier one in the places that matter most to human survival. Cold air often carries less moisture, and vast parts of the Ice Age world become arid. Deserts can expand. Grasslands can replace forests. Dust can blow across regions that today seem stable and green. the great ice sheets are fed where snow falls and persists, but farther from those accumulation zones, the cold often arrives with dryness. That is why so much of Eurasia develops the Mammoth Steppe, a huge belt of cold, open grassland and herb-rich terrain stretching across much of the north. It is not a featureless waste of snow. It is a productive, if highly seasonal, ecosystem shaped by low temperatures, sparse tree cover, strong winds, and grazing animals on a massive scale. The image of the Ice Age as uniformly buried under ice conceals this broader reality. Many human beings survive not on the edge of endless blizzards, but in dry, treeless expanses where the danger comes from exposure, scarcity, and climatic volatility as much as from deep snow. The atmosphere itself becomes part of the transformation. As ice sheets alter temperature, contrasts between north and south. Jet streams and storm tracks shift. Regions that once received regular rainfall may dry out. Others may experience changed seasonality, with moisture concentrated into brief windows. Monsoon systems weaken in some periods. Tropical zones cool too, though often less dramatically than high latitudes. In mountain regions, glaciers expand downward, reworking valleys and affecting river systems that sustain life far beyond the ice itself. The cumulative result is a world whose climate zones no longer sit where they once did. Habitats migrate. Species track them if they can. Those that cannot either adapt locally, retreat into refugia, or disappear. Human beings are caught inside this moving puzzle. A territory does not become unlivable overnight in the same way everywhere. Instead, habitable space narrows, opens elsewhere, then narrows again. Some regions act as refuges, pockets where conditions remain relatively tolerable despite the broader glacial regime. Parts of southern Europe, the Near East, Central Asia, and various lower latitude or topographically favourable areas seem to serve this role at different times. But refuge is a relative term. It does not mean comfort. It means merely that life can continue. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact location and importance of some of these refugia for different populations. Yet the larger pattern is clear enough: the growth of cold does not erase humanity evenly. It fragments the map of survival. There is also a rhythm to glacial history that resists simple storytelling. The last ice age is not one long monotone freeze. It contains pulses, reversals, fluctuations, and regional complexities. Even within the general trend toward greater cold leading up to the last glacial maximum, climates can oscillate. Some intervals become suddenly colder in the North Atlantic region. Others recover somewhat before declining again. The Earth system shudders as it changes state. This matters because both human populations and other species are responding not to a single stable challenge, but to repeated disruption. A group adapted to one local pattern may still be overwhelmed when that pattern changes again. A migration corridor may exist for centuries, then close. A river valley may become attractive, then dangerous. The old assumption that ancient people simply hunkered down under one unchanging glacial sky has given way to a more complicated picture of constant adjustment. Seen from far above, the spread of ice might almost seem impersonal, a set of physical processes indifferent to life below. Seen from ground level, it becomes intimate. A glacier grinding southward does not merely occupy land. It sends torrents of melt water into river systems. It produces fine sediments that winds lift into the air. It chills nearby climates. It changes the distributions of animals and plants that human groups depend on. It can force populations into closer contact or drive them apart. Even where the ice never arrives, its influence does. The world begins to behave differently because so much frozen mass now exists. And yet the cold does not win everything. This is important. If glacial conditions simply eliminated all ecological productivity outside narrow havens, the human story might end there. Instead, life reorganizes. Grasslands thrive in some regions. Large herbivores flourish. River corridors continue to support movement and resources. Coasts, though changed, still attract human attention where marine foods remain dependable. Some valleys offer shelter. Some south-facing slopes preserve slightly milder microclimates. In other words, the making of a frozen world is also the making of new patterns that clever, observant beings can exploit. The planet closes doors and opens others, though often in places and forms that require entirely new habits of living. That is the deeper significance of how the ice takes hold. It is not merely a background setting for human survival. It is the force that defines the terms of that survival. It redraws every useful map. It changes where prey can live, where trees can grow, where water can be found, where migration is possible, and where small human groups can still imagine a future. It creates the severe architecture of the late Pleistocene world, a world that seems less like a familiar Earth under bad weather, and more like an alternate version of the planet, one built out of reflection, dryness, exposed land, and long winter light. By the time the cold reaches its deepest hold, no one alive would remember the beginning of it. Children would be born into a climate their grandparents already accept as difficult, and their grandparents into one already altered from earlier ages. The slow violence of glaciation escapes direct memory because it works through accumulation. That may be why it is so difficult to grasp even now. The coldest period humans somehow lived through is not a sudden catastrophe like an eruption or a flood. It is a planetary tightening, a drawn-out narrowing of habitable possibilities, and because it happens slowly, people do what people always do. They adjust, they move, or stay, or gamble, or learn. They inherit a changed world and treat it as the world itself. Soon enough, that world at full strength will have to be seen clearly: the exposed plains, the vanished coastlines, the immense steppe, the broken habitats, the connections and separations created by lower seas and advancing ice. Only then does the full scale of the human challenge come into focus, because the map of the frozen planet is stranger than the modern eye expects, and in some ways more open, even as it becomes more severe. If someone could rise above the planet at the height of the Great Cold and look down with modern expectations, the first surprise would be how much land there is. The shorelines are wrong, continents seem swollen, seas withdrawn, and familiar coast pushed outward into broad plains of exposed sediment, river channels, marsh, and wind-scoured ground. The world is colder, yes, but it is also larger in a way that matters to any species able to move across it. Sea level has fallen by more than 100 meters. What had once been drowned continental shelf now lies open to sky and frost. In Europe, the basin beneath what is now the North Sea is no longer sea in the modern sense, but a low plain crossed by rivers and marshlands, intermittently habitable and deeply vulnerable to climatic shifts. In Southeast Asia, islands that today sit apart across warm water are fused into a massive extension of the mainland. In the far north, Siberia and Alaska are joined not by a narrow crossing but by Beringia, an entire region of steppe, tundra, river valleys, and cold dry plains stretching between worlds. This is the map of a broken planet. But broken does not mean lifeless. It means rearranged. the old assumptions of the warm world no longer hold. Forests that dominate large parts of Eurasia in later periods retreat or vanish from immense areas. Much of Europe and northern Asia becomes open country herb-rich steppe, tundra, sparse shrub, and cold grassland under an often dry sky. In some places the ground is locked by permafrost. In others it freezes and thaws seasonally, creating unstable surfaces and patterned earth. Far to the north, enormous ice sheets dominate whole regions and force life southward or outward along their margins. South of the ice lies a world that is not buried, but exposed, windswept, treeless, and vast. It is here, not only at the frozen edge itself, that one of the great Ice Age landscapes appears: the mammoth steppe, a biome so unlike most modern environments that it can seem almost mythical, though the evidence for it is substantial and widespread. The mammoth steppe stretches across much of northern Eurasia and into parts of North America, though not always continuously and not always in the same exact form. It is cold, but not simply snowy. It is dry enough in many areas to prevent the deep, damp blanket of forest from reclaiming the land. Grasses, sedges, forbs, and hardy flowering plants thrive in short growing seasons, supporting large grazing animals in numbers that seem counterintuitive to anyone who imagines cold as ecological emptiness. Woolly mammoths move across these plains. So do horses, bison, reindeer, muskoxen in some areas, saiga antelope, and woolly rhinoceroses in parts of Eurasia. Predators follow. Scavengers follow the predators. Humans, too, learn the terrain. What looks barren from a distance is in fact productive, though in a harsh and seasonal way. No single modern ecosystem matches it perfectly. Scholars still debate exactly how to characterize some of its regional variations, because the evidence comes pieced together from pollen, plant remains, isotopes, faunal assemblages, and frozen ground. But what survives in the record suggests a highly unusual cold grassland system capable of sustaining immense animal biomass. That changes the emotional geography of the Ice Age. The world is not only a place of scarcity, it is a place of concentration. Resources may be absent over huge distances and then suddenly abundant where migration routes, river valleys, or sheltered basins align. A group travelling through open steppe might endure days of exposure, limited fuel and uncertain water, only to encounter a corridor crowded with reindeer or horses moving with the season. Survival in such a world depends on reading patterns over large territories. The planet at glacial peak is broken into ecological mosaics, and humans have to know which pieces matter, when, and why. Europe at this time is especially unfamiliar to modern eyes. The far north is largely inaccessible or uninhabitable under ice. Britain is not an island in the modern sense, but connected at times to the continent across a plain that later disappears beneath the sea. Much of Central and Eastern Europe consists of open periglacial environments, with loose, fine, wind-blown sediment building up in places to remarkable thickness. The ground can be dry and dusty in warmer months, locked and brutal in winter. Southern Europe contains refugial zones where climate remains somewhat less severe, though even here conditions differ substantially from those of the Holocene. Mountain chains channel movement, shelter pockets of vegetation, and create local complexity. River systems become lines of life and travel. Caves and rock shelters matter intensely wherever they exist, not because humans only live in caves, but because the landscape makes any reliable shelter disproportionately valuable. In Asia, the scale becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind. Across Siberia, northern China, Mongolia, and Central Asia, climates vary, but the general pattern is one of cold adaptation, open environments, and fluctuating aridity. Some basins dry dramatically. Dust becomes a major presence in the atmosphere and in the sediments that survive to tell the story. High plateaus and mountain margins complicate the picture further, creating local barriers and refuges. Farther south, glacial climates still exert force even where ice itself is less dominant. Monsoon systems weaken in some intervals, lakes shrink or change, grasslands advance or retreat, habitable zones shift. Human movement across Asia does not occur over a blank map, but across a living puzzle of ecological pressure and possibility. In North America, the two great ice masses, the Laurentide to the east and the Cordilleran to the west, reshape the entire northern half of the continent. Their presence does more than block movement. They influence wind, drainage, and the climates of lands far to the south. Between or around them, possible routes for later human expansion will become matters of enormous importance, though much remains debated and timing is critical. South of the ice, environments range from steppe to woodland to desert. Depending on region and time, the continent is not uniformly inviting. It is fractured into zones of opportunity and danger, much like Eurasia, and the changing map ensures that any human dispersal must be exquisitely sensitive to timing. Then there is Beringia, perhaps the most famous of the exposed Ice Age lands, but often oversimplified. It is not merely a bridge crossed in haste. During periods of lower sea level, it is a broad, ecologically distinct region linking northeastern Asia and northwestern North America. Parts of it remain relatively dry and unglaciated, supporting grasses, herbs, and the animals that feed on them. Some models suggest it may have served not only as a passage but, at times, as a place where populations could linger or live for long periods. Though the details remain debated, ancient DNA, archaeology, and paleoenvironments do not yet resolve every question. Still, Beringia captures the peculiar logic of the Ice Age map. Cold creates barriers, but it also creates roads. Southeast Asia offers another version of the same principle. Lower sea levels expose Sunderland, joining mainland Southeast Asia with Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and other landmasses into a far larger tropical region. Rivers extend across plains that are now submerged. Habitats shift outward with the coast. Yet beyond Sunderland lies Wallacea, a zone of islands never fully connected to the continent, where water crossings still matter. Even in a colder world of exposed shelf, not all barriers vanish. Human populations moving through this broader region face a different version of climatic challenge than those on the Mammoth Steppe. But the glacial map still shapes what is possible. The world is more connected in some ways and sharply disconnected in others. One of the strangest consequences of the broken planet is that places now central to human life are often marginal, while areas now drowned or transformed become important corridors. The modern coastline hides entire chapters of prehistory underwater, campsites, migration paths, wetlands, estuaries, and hunting grounds that may once have supported people now lie on continental shelves submerged by the post-glacial sea. This means the record we possess is skewed. We know more about caves, uplands, river terraces, and the dry interiors that survive on land than about some of the coastal worlds people almost certainly used. The evidence remains incomplete not only because time destroys, but because rising seas erase or bury. When reconstructing the Ice Age map, scholars are always working with an archive partly lost beneath later oceans. At ground level, the broken planet is experienced through movement and memory. A band living near a river corridor may know that westward lies open country and risk, eastward a familiar hunting route, Southward, a sheltered valley where wood can still be found. Northward, a horizon no one crosses in winter. The map is not abstract, it is embodied. It exists in sore feet, in remembered landmarks, in seasonal timing, in the decision to stay 1 week longer or move now before the ice in the marsh gives way. To us, the last glacial maximum looks like a geological condition. To the people inside it, it is a lived topography of consequence. This is why the map matters so much for understanding human endurance. The coldest period does not present a single universal challenge. It creates many different cold worlds at once. Some are dry and open, some are mountainous and glaciated, some are relatively mild refuges crowded with people and game. Some are new plains exposed by falling seas. Some are dead ends. Others are routes into continents. A person well adapted to one of these landscapes may be helpless in another. Clothing, tools, prey knowledge, fuel use, shelter strategy, and social timing all have to match the local map. Human survival in the Great Cold is not a story of one invention applied everywhere. It is a story of regional intelligence on a planetary stage. And beneath everything lies instability. The map at Glacial Peak feels solid only in retrospect. In reality, it is always becoming something else. River channels migrate across exposed shelves. Permafrost advances and retreats. Grassland productivity rises and falls. Animal populations shift with season and climate. Ice margins pulse. Droughts intensify in one interval and ease in another. Even Beringia, so often imagined as fixed, changes through time in extent and habitability. No single explanation fully accounts for how human groups track all these changes, because the answer is likely many answers at once: inherited knowledge, close observation, cooperative movement, technological flexibility, and sometimes simple luck. Seen as a whole, the world of the Great Cold is severe but not monotonous. It is a continent-sized patchwork of hardship and opportunity, with edges sharper than those of the modern world. There are more open horizons, more raw land, fewer forests in many regions, larger herbivore communities in some places, and wider spaces between safe points. Some routes that seem impossible today once exist. Some familiar places are gone. Some seas are plains. Some plains are under ice. The planet is reduced and enlarged at the same time, reduced in warmth, enlarged in exposed surface, stripped of many comforts but rich in strange openings for those able to endure them. That is the true shape of the frozen earth, not merely white but recast, not merely hostile but reconfigured, and somewhere across these open shelves, dust-blown grasslands, refugial valleys, and river-bound paths are the human groups who must learn to belong to this map if they are to survive it at all. The geography is now set. The next question is what kind of people live at its edges, and what the record allows us to know about them. They do not look like masters of this world at first. Set against the scale of the open steppe or the shadow of ice at the northern horizon, human beings seem too slight, too exposed, too unfinished to belong here. A mammoth carries its own insulation in layers of fat, dense hair, and sheer mass. Reindeer move with hooves and migrations shaped by long inheritance. Arctic foxes change their coats with the season. Even the grasses seem designed for hardship, hugging the ground, surviving frost, returning when warmth briefly allows. Human beings arrive in this comparison with vulnerable skin, slow offspring, and a dangerous dependence on fire, tools, and one another. Yet it is precisely this unfinished quality that lets them endure. They are not committed to one ecological role. They can adjust, borrow, improvise, retreat, return, and learn. In the coldest period humans somehow live through, that flexibility matters more than brute adaptation. The people scattered across Eurasia during the height of the Great Cold are not a single uniform population moving in lockstep across a static landscape. They are groups with local histories, distinct traditions, and different degrees of contact with one another, living under pressures that vary from region to region. Their tools differ, their prey choices differ, their movement patterns differ. Even the pace of life differs according to whether they are occupying a river valley, sheltering in a less steppe basin, ranging across open tundra-like grassland, or retreating seasonally into milder refuges farther south. Archaeology preserves this diversity unevenly, but enough survives to show that Ice Age humanity is already richly regional. The old image of a generic cave person belonging to nowhere in particular collapses quickly under the evidence. What, then, does the record actually allow us to see? It sees bodies only rarely, and usually incompletely, a jaw, a skull, a few long bones, a burial. Most of the time, people appear through what they leave behind. Stone tools work to recognizable traditions, hearths, cut-marked animal bones, ornaments, pigments, dwelling traces, and fragments of daily life compressed into sediment. Ancient DNA has transformed the picture in recent decades, but it too comes in patches. With some regions richly sampled and others almost silent, the evidence remains incomplete, sometimes frustratingly so. Whole populations may have existed without leaving recoverable human remains. Whole migrations may be visible only through changes in technology or genetics later on. Scholars still debate the exact relationships among certain Upper Paleolithic populations in Eurasia. How often groups were isolated, and how often they reconnected. What survives in the record suggests a human world that is small in numbers but surprisingly dynamic. In Western and Central Eurasia during the later Upper Paleolithic, Homo sapiens has already established itself across a vast range of conditions. These are people who descend from earlier waves of modern humans entering and spreading through Eurasia, interacting at times with Neanderthals and later carrying those traces in their genomes. By the time the last glacial maximum tightens its grip, some populations contract into refugial areas where conditions remain comparatively bearable. Southern Europe becomes especially important in this regard. Parts of the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and the Balkans appear to offer sheltering zones where human communities can persist, despite the increasing severity farther north. But refuge is never a simple sanctuary. Competition may intensify where habitable territory shrinks. Animal communities shift. Mobility patterns change. A group surviving in a southern refuge is not resting outside history. It is adapting under compression. Farther east, across the plains and river systems of central and northern Eurasia, the picture is broader and in some ways harsher. People occupy stretches of steppe and forest steppe, exploit large herbivores, and develop ways of living in dry open cold. Sites in what is now Russia, Ukraine, and further into Siberia show technical skill and environmental competence on a scale that would once have seemed improbable. At some settlements, people build substantial structures using what the landscape provides, including mammoth bone in regions where timber is scarce. These are not random heaps of carcass remains, but planned uses of available material in places where shelter can mean survival. Elsewhere, seasonal camps suggest highly mobile groups following prey or circulating among known resource zones. A few sites preserve evidence of repeated use, implying that the landscape is not merely crossed but remembered. Human bodies from this era, where they are known, show variation but also hints of the physical realities imposed by cold living. Some populations in colder regions appear relatively robust, with body proportions that may help conserve heat, though one must be careful not to make climate into destiny. Biology matters, but culture is doing much of the work. A person survives glacial Eurasia not because their body alone solves the environment, but because it is wrapped, sheltered, fed, taught, and socially supported. The archaeological visibility of tailored clothing is limited because organic materials seldom preserve, yet bone needles from Upper Paleolithic contexts provide strong evidence that fitted garments exist in some populations. That detail changes everything. Loose hides draped over shoulders might suffice in cool conditions. Deep cold demands something more sophisticated layers, fastenings, hoods, leggings, footwear, and repairs. A needle is a small object with enormous climatic meaning. The same is true of mobility. People at the edge of severe cold cannot afford to move blindly. Stone raw materials traced across long distances show that some groups either travel widely or maintain exchange networks reaching beyond immediate territories. Marine shells appear far inland. High-quality flint turns up away from its geological source. Pigments are carried and used deliberately. None of this looks like a species reduced to day-by-day improvisation. It looks like planning stretched across landscapes. Social worlds extend beyond the single camp, though their exact form remains difficult to reconstruct, whether through seasonal aggregation, visiting, mate exchange, alliance, or long memory of who lives where. These links may be crucial to survival in low-density populations. Isolation can be deadly in more ways than one. Small groups cut off too completely risk demographic collapse, reduced mate choice, and the loss of knowledge that only larger social networks can stabilize. Children are almost invisible in the record, which may be why it is easy to underestimate how central they are to the story. In reality, every Ice Age population lives or dies by whether children can survive repeated winters, disease, injury, and nutritional stress. The cold magnifies all ordinary vulnerabilities. Infants lose heat quickly. Young bodies require constant care, constant fuel, constant protection from exposure. A successful society in such conditions is therefore not just a society of skilled hunters, it is a society capable of buffering the helpless. Someone has to carry children, warm them, feed them softened foods, maintain fires, sew clothing, prepare bedding, and keep the social structure intact when resources dip. The record rarely states this directly, but it is implied everywhere. No human population crosses the Great Cold without systems of care far more elaborate than the sparse remains alone would suggest. Burials offer some of the most haunting glimpses of personhood in this frozen world. Not many survive, but the ones that do matter greatly. Some Upper Paleolithic burials include ornaments, ochre, carefully arranged bodies, grave goods, and evidence of ritual attention. Even in severe climates, people devote time and precious resources to the dead. That choice is telling. It suggests communities whose emotional and symbolic lives remain intact under pressure, perhaps even intensified by it. A landscape of scarcity does not erase meaning. In some cases, it may deepen it. Scholars still debate the significance of specific burial practices and whether they indicate rank, kinship, identity, or beliefs we cannot fully recover. What survives in the record suggests at least this much. Ice Age people do not merely persist biologically. They persist as social and symbolic beings. The farther north and east one looks, the more impressive the human presence can become. By the Upper Paleolithic, Modern humans have reached deep into Siberia, occupying regions with severe seasonal cold and difficult logistics. These populations may not be numerous, and continuity is not always easy to establish, but their existence proves something essential. The margins of habitable Eurasia are wider than once assumed. Human skill pushes into places that would seem beyond reasonable expectation for Pleistocene foragers. This does not mean every region is occupied continuously. Some are probably abandoned during the harshest intervals and recolonized later. The pulse of presence and absence is part of the story. Still, each site at these latitudes forces the same conclusion: the line between possible and impossible for Ice Age humans lies farther outward than older theories allowed. At the same time, the population picture remains precarious. Genetic evidence hints that human groups often pass through narrow bottlenecks, local extinctions, and later expansions. Some lineages vanish entirely, others spread and replace or absorb neighboring groups. The human map is full of blank spaces and broken continuity. It is easy to speak of people surviving the cold, but survival does not necessarily mean every population survives. Some may disappear without descendants. Some cultural traditions may end abruptly. Some refugees may fail. The species continues, but not in a neat or universal way. No single explanation fully accounts for which groups endure, which move, and which are lost, because climate is only one pressure among many. Prey, availability, disease, injury, fertility, social cohesion, and simple chance all matter. And yet, seen across the breadth of Eurasia, one thing becomes unmistakable. The people at the edge are not hanging on by accident. They are observant, technically capable, geographically literate, and deeply social. They understand materials. They understand animals. They understand timing. They are able to take an exposed and dangerous landscape and turn parts of it into something livable, not by softening it, but by fitting themselves to its demands. A stand of fuel, a migrating herd, a protected depression in the ground, a source of good stone, a south-facing slope, a remembered camp, a reliable spring thaw. These become the coordinates of survival. The scale is intimate, but the achievement is enormous. This is perhaps the most difficult thing for the modern imagination to hold. We are used to measuring success through expansion, abundance, and visible control. Ice Age people often succeed through precision instead. They place themselves correctly in a hostile world. They move at the right time. They keep knowledge alive. They make enough clothing, enough fire, enough tools, enough alliances, enough food stores or dried meat. Enough good decisions in sequence to carry a group through another winter. It is not glamorous. It is not guaranteed. But it works often enough to keep human presence woven through the cold lands of Eurasia. Sooner or later, though, the question becomes more practical. Knowing who these people are and where they live only leads to a harder issue: how they actually endure the day-to-day reality of deep cold. Because beyond migration, genetics, and archaeological traces lies the blunt arithmetic of survival itself: food, fuel, shelter, clothing, injury, darkness, and the problem of making one fragile body last through a season determined to break it. The cold becomes truly real at the level of simple tasks, not the grand map of the Ice Age, not the migration of continents under ice, not the sweep of mammoth herds under a pale sky, but the smaller things that cannot be avoided. Finding enough dry fuel before dusk, keeping a fire alive through wind, cutting meat before it freezes too hard to work, drying hides without letting them stiffen beyond use, mending a seam in failing light. carrying water without losing heat faster than the body can spare it, judging whether a hunt is worth the calories it will consume. The world of deep glacial cold is built from these calculations. Survival does not happen through one dramatic act of endurance. It happens through 1,000 acts of competence, most of them quiet, all of them necessary. Food is the first law. In severe climates, hunger is not merely uncomfortable, it is thermodynamic failure. The body needs fuel to maintain warmth, movement, healing, thought, and the labor of daily life. In cold conditions, energy demands rise sharply, especially for highly mobile foragers exposed to wind, distance, and irregular success. This means that hunting is not a supplement to life. In many Ice Age settings, it is the central mechanism by which life can continue. Large herbivores become crucial not simply because they provide meat, but because they provide dense calories, fat, marrow, hide, sinew, bone, antler, and sometimes predictable movement across the landscape. A successful kill can supply far more than food. It can mean clothing, tools, shelter material, cordage, fuel from bone or fat in wood-poor regions, and the temporary easing of fear. That does not mean Ice Age people live by mammoth hunting alone, despite the popular image. Mammoths loom large in the imagination because they are spectacular and because their bones sometimes preserve in dramatic ways at archaeological sites. But many groups rely heavily on reindeer, horse, bison, saiga, ibex, red deer, fish, hares, birds, and whatever other species the local ecology offers. The evidence remains incomplete because preservation varies so greatly, and the relative importance of hunting strategies differs from region to region. What survives in the record suggests a flexible pattern rather than a single heroic prey species. Humans survive the cold not by betting everything on rare monumental kills, but by exploiting a range of animals with sharp attention to season, terrain, risk, and return. Reindeer herds in particular appear immensely important across parts of Eurasia, because their migrations can be anticipated and because they provide reliable meat, fat, hides, antler, and transportable resources in large quantities. Fat matters almost as much as meat, perhaps more at certain times. Lean meat alone cannot sustain human beings indefinitely, in deep cold, where calories are precious and plant foods may be limited or seasonal. Access to animal fat becomes decisive. Marrow inside long bones, grease rendered from cancellous bone, stored body fat from animals taken at the right season, and perhaps preserved fatty tissues all help turn hunting into genuine survival rather than delayed starvation. This is one reason butchery skill matters so much. Bones are not discarded casually if they contain nourishment. A carcass must be understood in detail. Which cuts spoil first, which parts freeze hardest, which tissues can be dried, which bones should be cracked immediately, which pieces are worth hauling back to camp. The practical intelligence involved here is enormous, and archaeology catches only glimpses of it in cut marks, fracture patterns, burn traces, and bone concentrations around old hearths. Hunting itself is far more than courage. In a cold landscape, recklessness can kill the hunters before it kills the prey. People must know migration routes, snow conditions, river crossings, animal behavior under changing weather, and the difference between a pursuit that can be finished and one that wastes irreplaceable energy. Weapons are built accordingly. Stone blades and points are shaped with care. Spears, throwing weapons, thrusting implements, and composite tools are maintained because failure at the wrong moment is costly in more ways than one. Even a successful hunt can produce disaster if weather turns, if the group is too far from shelter, or if a large carcass cannot be processed before scavengers arrive, or the cold locks it into useless hardness. The drama of Ice Age hunting is therefore not only in the kill, it lies in planning, coordination, transport, and the rapid conversion of danger into stored value. Storage itself is a hidden but essential part of the story. In sub-freezing or near-freezing conditions, meat can sometimes be preserved naturally for longer periods than in warmer climates, though this depends on scavengers, microbial action, thaw cycles, and access security. Drying, smoking, freezing, caching in protected places, or exploiting cold ground may all have played roles, though direct evidence is often scarce. Scholars still debate how extensive deliberate food storage is among different Upper Paleolithic groups. The archaeological record is not generous with unambiguous answers, yet no single explanation fully accounts for survival in severe winters without assuming at least some capacity to smooth out short-term scarcity. A large kill that must be eaten immediately is valuable. A large kill that can be carried across days or weeks is transformative. Even partial storage changes the rhythm of risk. Plant foods do not disappear from the human menu simply because the climate is cold, but their role shifts with geography and season. Seeds, roots, tubers, nuts where available, berries in the right months, inner bark in desperate circumstances, and other gathered foods may contribute important vitamins, fiber, and supplementary calories. The challenge is that glacial landscapes often reduce plant abundance, compress growing seasons, or make useful species highly localized. This means gathered foods are often opportunistic and intensely dependent on local ecological knowledge. A modern observer might underestimate them because preservation is poor and because large hunted animals dominate the visible record. But what survives in the record suggests that successful foragers pay attention to every usable resource the land offers. In hard seasons, small contributions matter. Then there is shelter, the second law after food. Exposure kills with terrifying efficiency. A person who can hunt brilliantly may still die because wind strips heat faster than calories can replace it. Shelter during the great cold does not always mean caves, though caves matter whenever they exist. Many regions do not offer them, or not in the right places for seasonal use. People therefore create protected environments from what the land allows hide stretched over frames. Brush and wood constructions, snow or earth modifications, and in some extraordinary cases substantial dwellings incorporating mammoth bone as structural support where large timber is absent. Sites such as those from parts of Eastern Europe hint at repeated occupation and deliberate domestic organization hearths, activity zones, refuse patterns, and built space rather than simple momentary camps. To build a shelter in deep cold is to manufacture a microclimate. A wall, even a low one, changes the mathematics of survival. So does orientation, so does insulation under the body, so does the control of smoke, airflow, and entrance exposure. Clothing may be even more decisive than shelter, because people carry it with them. The human body without proper protection is catastrophically unsuited to sustained glacial conditions. Bone needles found in Upper Paleolithic contexts are among the clearest signs that tailored clothing becomes part of the survival package in at least some populations. A fitted garment traps heat more effectively, prevents drafts, and allows movement without constant exposure. Footwear matters. Head coverings matter. Layering matters. Dryness matters most of all. Wet clothing in cold conditions can become a death sentence. This means hides must be selected, scraped, softened, cut, sewn, repaired, and likely adapted to different seasons and activities. Fur direction may matter, inner and outer layers may matter. Children must be clothed too, and probably with even greater care. Clothing is not a side issue in the Ice Age. It is portable shelter stitched into daily life. Fire sits at the centre of everything. Without it, much of the human presence in the coldest regions becomes difficult to imagine. Fire provides warmth, cooked food, light, predator deterrence, a place for tool manufacture, drying for clothing and hides, and a focus for social life. Yet maintaining fire in glacial environments is a technical challenge of its own. Fuel may be scarce in treeless steppe zones. Wood, if present, may be patchy, wet, green, or distant. Dung, bone, and fat may supplement or replace wood in some contexts, though the details remain debated and regionally variable. Hearths must be protected from wind. Embers may need to be preserved carefully overnight. Fire-starting knowledge must be reliable, because dependence without mastery is useless. To a modern household, heat feels passive, something delivered. To Ice Age humans, it is an active and continuous achievement. What makes this entire system work is not any single invention, but the joining of many partial solutions. A warm shelter without enough food fails. Good hunting without clothing fails. Fire without fuel fails. Abundant meat without social sharing may fail when injury or bad luck strikes. The cold punishes weak links. It exposes whether a society has redundancy built into its habits. This may be why cooperation matters so much. Hunting large game often requires coordinated action. Butchery and transport require extra hands. Childcare requires labour that cannot always coincide with hunting. Firewood gathering takes time and energy. Sowing, repair, and processing do not happen by magic. A winter camp survives because work is distributed, not because one heroic individual does everything well. There is also the problem of mobility. Staying in one place too long can exhaust local resources. Moving too often can waste energy and expose the group to greater danger. The correct answer changes with season, prey, weather, and the composition of the group. A band with infants, injured members, or elderly people may move differently from one composed largely of able adults. Some sites suggest repeated seasonal return, implying a cyclical use of territory rather than endless wandering. Others look like short-term camps linked to hunting events. In each case, movement is strategic. People are not drifting through the Ice Age. They are making repeated judgments about when staying becomes more dangerous than going. Lesser-known details sometimes reveal the sophistication of that judgment better than the grand narrative does. At certain sites, the pattern of carcass transport suggests people are selective, carrying high-value body parts rather than entire animals over long distances. At others, concentrations of small beads, ornaments, or pigments imply that even in severe climates, people invest time in identity, signaling, and perhaps social bonds that help sustain wider networks. Microwear on tools can reveal hide scraping, plant processing, and the steady labour of maintenance rather than only moments of dramatic action. The frozen world is kept livable by routine skill, and routine is exactly what makes the achievement so extraordinary. A single blizzard survived is impressive. A way of life built to survive thousands of winters is something else entirely. The people of the Great Cold do not endure because they are superhuman. They endure because they reduce a hostile environment into manageable tasks and then perform those tasks with astonishing consistency. They know how to read tracks in bad light, how to split marrow bones efficiently, how to insulate sleeping places, how to watch weather, how to repair damage before it becomes fatal, how to decide when to risk a hunt and when to wait. In a world that seems almost designed to eliminate them, they make survival procedural. That is the deeper reality of hunting in the dead of winter. It is not only about courage in the face of giant animals and endless cold. It is about systems, food systems, heat systems, movement systems, material systems held together by memory and labor. And once those practical needs are met, or met well enough to keep death temporarily at bay, another question emerges. What kind of social life can exist in such a world, because no one survives the Ice Age by technique alone? Skill keeps people alive from one day to the next, but it is the fragile warmth of family, care, and shared obligation that carries them across generations. Warmth in the Ice Age is never only a physical thing. It is a social achievement, built and rebuilt every day by people whose lives depend on staying close enough to one another that knowledge, labor, and care do not break apart under pressure. The fire matters, the shelter matters, the clothing matters, but none of them hold for long without the invisible structure around them who shares food, who watches the children, who remembers the route back to the spring camp, who tends the injured hand before it becomes useless, who notices that a seam is opening in someone's winter gear, who keeps embers alive while others sleep. In the deep cold, family is not a sentimental extra, it is infrastructure. Affection may be hard to recover from archaeology, but dependence is everywhere. A glacial camp at dusk is a place where this dependence becomes visible. Someone returns with fuel, if fuel can be found. Someone has been scraping hide or repairing clothing by the fading light. Someone has been cutting meat into portions small enough to dry, roast, or share. Someone has been keeping children away from hazards while also teaching them, intentionally or not, how this world works. Someone old enough to remember earlier winters may be tracking signs. Others have not yet noticed the wind direction changing, the silence of birds, the condition of snow underfoot, the strange behavior of reindeer before a storm. None of these tasks looks monumental in isolation. Together they form the small defended space in which human life can continue. It is easy to imagine Ice Age groups as simple units made only for movement and survival, but the record suggests something more layered. These are not merely clusters of bodies huddled against the weather. They are social systems with obligations, preferences, habits, and probably tensions. They have kin ties, mating networks, divisions of labor that may shift with age, ability, and circumstance, and rules spoken or unspoken about sharing and access. The exact structure of those systems is difficult to reconstruct, and scholars still debate how large Upper Paleolithic groups tend to be at different times of year, how often they aggregate, and how formal exchange or alliance networks may function. What survives in the record suggests a rhythm of smaller mobile groups connected to wider social worlds, rather than isolated families wandering alone. That wider connection may be one of the quiet reasons the species survives. Low population density creates a hidden danger. A landscape may appear empty enough to reduce competition, but emptiness can be lethal if it means too few allies, too little mate choice, and too much vulnerability when accidents happen. Human beings are not designed to thrive in permanent isolation. In severe climates, this becomes even more obvious. A broken leg, a difficult birth, a failed hunting spell, a period of illness, or the death of a highly knowledgeable person can destabilize a small group rapidly. Social ties beyond the immediate camp therefore matter as insurance. Exchange of materials across distance, similarities and shifts in tool traditions, and the movement of ornaments or shells far from their source all hint at wider networks, though the exact mechanisms remain uncertain. These may be friendships, seasonal meetings, marriage ties, reciprocal obligations, or simply remembered pathways to other people in a difficult world. No single explanation fully accounts for the resilience of small Ice Age populations, but durable social connection almost certainly belongs near the centre of the answer. Children sharpen the stakes of everything. The survival of a cold-adapted community is measured less by one season's hunting success than by whether enough children can be carried safely through repeated winters. Childhood in deep cold is fragile. Infants lose heat quickly, require constant feeding, and demand a level of adult investment that makes solitary survival fantasies impossible. A group able to raise children successfully in such conditions is a group capable of extraordinary coordination. Clothes must be made smaller and more carefully fitted. Sleeping areas must be warmer and better insulated. Food must be processed into forms the young can eat. Sick children must be monitored. Moving camp becomes more complicated when some members cannot walk far, carry loads, or regulate body temperature effectively. The Ice Age makes all ordinary human dependency more expensive, and yet dependency remains the centre of human life. That fact alone tells something important about how strong cooperative care must be. Older people matter for a different reason. If they survive, they carry stored landscape knowledge that no tool can replace. A person who remembers 3 or 4 difficult winters may know the places where game fails last, where the river opens earliest, where wood can still be found under snow, where a valley traps killing cold, where another group may be encountered without violence. Memory becomes a survival resource. In oral societies with low population density and dangerous environments, the experienced mind may be as important as the strong body. Archaeology cannot easily measure this, but it can hint at it indirectly through continuity of site use, recurring seasonal occupation, and the transmission of complex technological traditions. Knowledge does not preserve itself. Someone has to keep it alive long enough for others to learn it. Care for the injured and vulnerable appears too, though only in fragments. There are prehistoric human remains from various periods showing survival after serious injury or disability, implying that others assisted them. One must be cautious about projecting too much from a small sample. But the broader point stands. In a harsh environment, tolerance for temporary weakness is not evidence against practicality. It may be part of practicality, a skilled toolmaker, tracker, healer. Or elder does not lose all value because of injury. A social world capable of buffering weakness may outlast one that discards it. What survives in the record suggests that Ice Age communities, like later human ones, sometimes invested in people who could not immediately repay the effort in calories or labour. Inside the shelter itself, another kind of warmth appears: routine intimacy. Clothing is repaired not in abstraction, but for particular bodies. Food is portioned among familiar people. Infants are held close. Hands work near the fire while stories or remembered directions pass between generations. The emotional atmosphere is unrecoverable in detail, but not unimaginable. Tension, exhaustion, grief, affection, rivalry, loyalty, irritation. Attachment, none of these vanish because the climate is severe. If anything, the pressure of the environment likely heightens them. A winter camp is not a pure machine of efficiency. It is a human place, with all the density that implies. This matters because people do not endure year after year on utility alone. A species dependent on prolonged childhood and intense learning must produce belonging as well as shelter. Symbolic life continues even here, and that may be one of the most revealing details of all. Ornamentation, beads, ochre, carved objects, personal decoration, and deliberate burial practices suggest that people living under intense ecological pressure still devote time and material to identity and meaning. From a narrow survival perspective, this can seem extravagant. In reality, it may be essential. Shared symbols can reinforce kinship, mark affiliation, regulate marriage networks, express grief, and make visible the relationships on which survival depends. Beauty is not separate from endurance. It may help hold communities together. Scholars still debate the exact meaning of many symbolic objects from the Upper Paleolithic, because the evidence remains incomplete and interpretation is always limited. But what survives in the record suggests lives not reduced to calories and cold. There is also the question of rhythm. Large groups may not live together all the time. Ethnographic analogy, used cautiously, suggests that some hunter-gatherer populations in difficult environments alternate between smaller mobile bands and larger seasonal gatherings. Something similar may well have occurred in parts of the Upper Paleolithic. During certain periods, resources are concentrated enough to support aggregation. At other times, smaller groups disperse to reduce pressure on local supplies. If so, then family is nested inside larger seasonal society. People would spend part of the year in intimate, labour-sharing units, and part in broader social fields where mates are found, alliances renewed, information exchanged, disputes handled, rituals enacted, and identities reinforced. The archaeological record offers hints of such patterns in site size, seasonality, and artifact distributions, though certainty is elusive. Still, the model fits the basic challenge well. To survive cold, humans need both closeness and range-close daily care, wide social connection. Women's labour in this world is often obscured by the old overemphasis on dramatic hunting scenes. But that obscurity distorts reality. The work of making and maintaining clothing, processing hides, preparing food, caring for children, managing domestic fire, preserving resources, gathering usable plant material, and sustaining social continuity is not secondary to survival. It is survival. Men likely hunt large game in many contexts, though even that should not be turned into a rigid universal rule, and women likely contribute in varied ways beyond any simplistic division. The exact balance differs by group and environment. What matters is that the camp survives because many forms of labour converge. The cold does not reward cultures that misunderstand their own dependencies, and beneath all of this lies fragility. A family can be loving and still hungry. A camp can be skilled and still unlucky. Children can be carefully guarded and still die. Small groups can do everything right and still be broken by disease, storm, accident, or a run of missed hunts. The human answer to the Ice Age is powerful, but it is never absolute. That is why the traces of tenderness matter so much. They exist not in a safe world, but in a dangerous one. Warmth, in the deepest sense, is what people make for one another against a landscape that offers very little of it on its own. This is the part of the story that resists the usual harshness of prehistoric imagination. The Great Cold is not only a test of weapons, fire, and mobility. It is a test of whether small communities can remain socially whole under prolonged pressure. Again and again, the answer seems to be yes imperfectly, precariously, but often enough to matter. Families, however exactly formed, create the first buffer against the world. Wider networks create the second. Between them, the human species finds a way to keep children alive, knowledge moving, and belonging intact. Yet survival through shared warmth leads toward a darker question. Even with all this cooperation, all this skill, and all this care, how close does humanity come to disappearing anyway? The numbers are impossible to ignore for long. Populations remain sparse. Landscapes are unstable. Genetic traces hint at narrow passages through time. Somewhere behind the visible story of endurance lies the unsettling possibility that our species survives the cold not securely, but barely. For all the evidence of skill, care, and adaptation, there is a quieter, more unsettling possibility woven through the Ice Age record. It is not visible in any single campsite or tool, not written plainly in the bones or the hearths, but it emerges when the scale is widened and the fragments are assembled. At certain points in human prehistory, the number of people alive may have been far lower than we are comfortable imagining. Not just small compared to today, but small enough that the survival of the species itself is no longer something to take for granted. The cold does not need to kill everyone at once to threaten extinction. It only needs to narrow the margins enough that recovery becomes uncertain. This is the bottleneck question. Did the harshest phases of the Ice Age reduce human populations to dangerously low levels? And if so, how close did things come to failing altogether? The answer is not simple, and it is not agreed upon in full. Scholars still debate the scale and timing of population contractions, because the evidence comes indirectly from genetic patterns, from the distribution and density of archaeological sites, from ecological reconstructions, and from the absence as much as the presence of human traces. No single line of evidence is decisive on its own, but together they suggest a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Human populations during the coldest periods were often thinly spread, regionally fragmented, and at times sharply reduced. Genetic studies provide one of the clearest windows into this problem. When scientists examine patterns of variation in ancient and modern human DNA, they can sometimes infer past population sizes and events where numbers may have dropped significantly. Certain signals reduce genetic diversity, long stretches of shared ancestry, sudden expansions following periods of constraint can point toward bottlenecks. In the context of the late Pleistocene, some of these patterns suggest that human groups passed through narrow corridors of survival, where relatively few individuals contributed disproportionately to later populations. This does not mean there was ever a single moment when humanity hovered on the edge of total extinction, but it does suggest that the number of people alive at certain times may have been surprisingly low, perhaps in the tens of thousands globally, or even less in some models. The exact figures remain debated, and the uncertainties are large, but the direction of the evidence is consistent. The Ice Age was not a time of comfortable abundance. Archaeology tells a similar story in a different language. There are regions where human presence appears to fade or vanish for long stretches of time. Sites become sparse, occupation layers thin out. Entire areas may show little or no evidence of sustained habitation during the harshest climatic phases. This does not always mean people are completely absent. It may reflect preservation bias or shifts to landscapes now underwater, but in some cases the pattern is too strong to ignore. Parts of northern Europe, for example, are largely abandoned or only intermittently occupied when ice and periglacial conditions become most severe. Human groups contract into refugial zones, leaving vast territories empty or nearly so. Later, as conditions improve, those same regions are recolonized. The map of human presence expands and contracts like a living thing under pressure. What makes this more than a simple story of migration is the scale of the gaps. When populations become small and isolated, they are vulnerable in ways that go beyond climate. A single harsh winter, a disease outbreak, a run of poor hunting seasons, or a breakdown in social cohesion can wipe out an entire group. If neighbouring groups are too distant, too few, or too disconnected, there may be no one to replace them or absorb their knowledge. This is how extinction works at the level of small populations, not through a single catastrophic event, but through cumulative fragility. The Ice Age creates exactly the kind of environment where such fragility becomes common, and yet the species does not collapse. That is the other half of the mystery. Despite all the pressure, despite the apparent contractions and disappearances, Homo sapiens continues, and in time expands again. This suggests that while bottlenecks occur, they are not absolute dead ends. Somewhere, populations remain large enough, connected enough, or adaptable enough to recover. Refugia play a role here, acting as reservoirs of human life during the worst phases. But refugia alone are not sufficient as an explanation. A refuge that becomes too crowded may generate its own pressures. Resources can be overused. Competition can intensify. Social tensions can rise. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a balance between contraction and resilience rather than simple retreat. One possibility is that human social structure itself acts as a buffer against complete collapse. Even small populations may maintain wider networks of connection, allowing genes, ideas, and individuals to move between groups. This reduces the risks associated with isolation. It also allows for rapid expansion when conditions improve. A group that survives in a refuge does not need to reinvent everything from nothing when the cold begins to ease. It carries forward knowledge, technology, and social ties that can be redeployed across newly available landscapes. In this sense, the Ice Age may have functioned not only as a filter, reducing populations, but also as a kind of crucible, concentrating certain traits: flexibility, cooperation, long-distance connection that become even more important later. Another factor is the unevenness of the cold itself. The last glacial maximum is severe, but it is not uniformly lethal everywhere. Some regions remain more stable than others. Microclimates exist. River valleys, coastal margins, and south-facing slopes can offer slightly better conditions than the surrounding landscape. These differences may seem minor, but in a marginal environment they can determine survival. A valley that retains water, a slope that catches more sunlight, a corridor where animals continue to pass, these become lifelines. Populations that happen to occupy such spaces may endure where others cannot. Over time, these pockets of survival can seed wider recovery. There is also the question of timing. The Ice Age is not static. Even during the coldest phases, there are fluctuations, brief intervals where conditions ease slightly or shift in ways that open new opportunities. Human groups that can respond quickly, moving into newly habitable areas, exploiting changing animal distributions, adjusting their strategies may gain an advantage. Those that cannot may be left behind. The evidence for these short-term climatic oscillations is strong in ice cores and other records, but linking them precisely to human responses remains challenging. The archaeological record is too coarse in many places to capture rapid changes. Still, the broader pattern suggests that survival is not only about enduring the worst conditions, but also about recognizing and using the brief moments when the world becomes less hostile. What emerges from all this is a picture of human survival that is both impressive and precarious. The species is not simply resilient in a blanket sense. It is resilient in patches, through networks, through repeated cycles of contraction and expansion. Some groups disappear, others persist. Some traditions end, others spread. The continuity we see in hindsight is built from many discontinuities along the way. No single explanation fully accounts for how this works, because it is the result of many overlapping processes: climate, ecology, technology, social structure, chance. There is a temptation to turn this into a story of inevitability, to assume that because humans survive, they were always destined to do so. The Ice Age record resists that kind of certainty. It shows a species under pressure, navigating a world that often seems close to unlivable, relying on a combination of skill and circumstance. The fact that Homo sapiens makes it through does not mean the outcome was guaranteed. It means that enough groups, in enough places, at enough times, managed to avoid the many ways in which failure could occur. And perhaps that is the most revealing aspect of the bottleneck question. It forces a shift in perspective. Instead of asking how humans conquered the Ice Age, it asks how they avoided being erased by it. The answer is not a single breakthrough or a single adaptation. It is a pattern of survival repeated across generations. Often in the face of conditions that leave little room for error, it is a story of narrow margins, of recoveries after losses, of persistence without certainty. By the time the cold begins to ease, the human species has already passed through these narrow passages. The populations that remain carry the imprint of that journey in their genes, in their technologies, in their social structures, and in the patterns of movement that will soon reshape the world again. But before that expansion can be understood, there is another layer to the Ice Age story that cannot be ignored. Humans are not alone in this landscape. They share it, or recently shared it, with other human species neighbours, rivals, and relatives whose fate unfolds alongside their own, under the same cold sky. Once the population question is faced honestly, the frozen world begins to look different again. It is no longer only a place of refuges and bottlenecks, but a place of roots thin, dangerous, often temporary roots, yet roots all the same. The Ice Age does not simply trap human beings inside shrinking habitable pockets. It also opens pathways that do not exist in warmer ages, or makes older pathways newly important. Lower seas expose plains. Forests retreat and leave broad open corridors. River valleys become guides through otherwise punishing terrain. Coastal shelves extend outward. Grassland belts connect distant regions. A world under climatic stress becomes, in certain moments, a world of movement. The question is not whether people move through it. They clearly do. The harder question is how they know where movement is possible, and how they survive it when every journey risks becoming disappearance. Travel in the Great Cold is not a romantic crossing of untouched wilderness. It is a calculation of exposure, calories, timing, and trust. A band cannot simply set out across open country because curiosity suggests it. They need a reason strong enough to justify the danger. Game may have shifted. A familiar valley may no longer support enough life. Conflict with neighbouring groups may push people outward. Seasonal rounds may gradually extend into new territory. A generation growing up on one edge of the known world may follow animals a little farther than their parents did, then farther still. Some movement is probably deliberate exploration. Much of it is likely incremental, made from many short decisions that only later look like migration on a map. That matters because ancient movement rarely resembles the arrows drawn in textbooks. It is not one people picking up from one point and arriving neatly at another. It is pauses, returns, failed attempts, seasonal use before permanent occupation, and long periods where a route remains possible but not continuously used. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the timing and character of many Upper Paleolithic movements. What survives in the record suggests mobility at multiple scales: daily foraging, seasonal relocation, long-distance exchange, and over generations. Major geographic expansion. These scales overlap. A path that begins as a hunting corridor can become a habitual route. A seasonal return can become settlement. A refuge can become a launching point. In glacial Eurasia, some of the most important routes are written by ecology rather than by topography alone. Herd animals do not move randomly. Reindeer, horse, bison, and other large prey follow seasonal patterns tied to grazing, snow cover, water access, breeding, and insect pressure. Human groups watching these animals learn not only where food is, but where the land is crossable, where valleys open, where river ice holds, where vegetation returns first after winter. To follow prey is often to inherit a map. This may be one reason why open steppe and steppe tundra landscapes, harsh as they are, become workable for human expansion. They are dangerous, but legible. Their horizons reveal movement. Their herds mark routes through space and season. River corridors are equally important. In a cold world, rivers are not merely sources of water. They are lines of orientation, travel, raw material access, animal concentration, and sometimes comparatively sheltered vegetation. Even when frozen in winter, they structure the landscape. Camps cluster near them. Movement parallels them. Their valleys cut through uplands and connect otherwise fragmented zones. In some areas they may also moderate local conditions slightly, sustaining richer ecologies than the surrounding open country. Archaeology again and again finds human occupation tied to these linear landscapes. This is not surprising. A river organizes uncertainty. It gives direction to movement across a world where direction matters intensely. There are also coastal routes, though they're harder to see because the later sea has swallowed so much of the evidence. During glacial low sea levels, coastlines lie far beyond their modern positions in many regions. This creates broad shelf plains, estuaries, lagoons, and marine margins that could support human life with a mixture of terrestrial and aquatic resources. In some parts of the world, coasts may offer relatively reliable food compared with inland zones subject to extreme seasonal stress. Yet reconstructing these routes is difficult because the campsites, middens, and stopping places that would prove them often lie underwater now. The archaeological silence of drowned landscapes should not be mistaken for absence. What survives in the record suggests that humans likely used coastal environments more than the present land-based evidence alone can show. The great exposed regions created by lower sea levels become especially significant here. Beringia is the most famous case, but it is best understood not as a narrow bridge crossed in a dramatic moment, but as a broad zone that supports movement and, at times, residence. To cross Beringia is not necessarily to sprint from Asia into the Americas. It may involve generations living within a cold, dry region of grass, herb, and river systems, adjusting to local conditions and moving when opportunities open. Some models propose periods of relative isolation in Beringia before expansion deeper into the Americas. Others emphasize repeated connections and changing ecological windows. Scholars still debate the details, particularly the timing and exact routes southward, whether along coastal margins, interior corridors, or some combination that shifts over time. No single explanation fully accounts for the peopling of the Americas, but the glacial map clearly shapes the problem. Human movement depends on ice margins, sea levels, ecological productivity, and the ability to read a continent-sized puzzle correctly. Across northern Eurasia, routes through the cold are no less complex. Siberia is often imagined as a terminal hardship, but during parts of the Upper Paleolithic, it is also a zone of remarkable human reach. People move eastward into regions of deep seasonal severity, occupying river basins and steppe environments that demand both mobility and precision. This movement is not evidence that conditions are easy. It is evidence that certain human groups become highly competent at reading and exploiting severe cold landscapes. Such expansion may proceed in pulses, with some territories occupied intermittently, others more persistently. Some sites suggest long-distance raw material transport, implying wide-ranging or durable social links across thinly populated spaces. The farther one follows these routes, the more obvious it becomes that the Ice Age world is not merely survived in place, it is traversed. Still, movement through an icy world has costs beyond exposure and hunger. Mobility can strain social ties if small groups separate too far for too long. It can expose people to unfamiliar disease environments, though the evidence for this is difficult to recover directly. It can place groups into conflict over overlapping hunting grounds or scarce refugial resources. It can also produce failure in ways archaeology barely records. A route attempted once and abandoned may leave almost no trace. A small party lost in severe weather may vanish from history entirely. The paths we know are partly the ones that succeed often enough to leave evidence. Behind them lie countless unknown journeys, some successful, some not. Technology shapes these movements, though probably not always through dramatic inventions. Well-made clothing extends the range of possible travel. Portable fire-making knowledge changes where overnight stops can be attempted. Composite weapons and reliable stone supply affect the confidence with which people can enter new territory. Containers, carrying systems, hide-working skill, and perhaps simple forms of sled-like transport in some conditions may all matter. Though the archaeological evidence for many such perishable technologies is frustratingly sparse. What survives in the record tends to preserve stone, bone, and the occasional extraordinary organic fragment. Yet movement on this scale implies a much richer toolkit than the visible remains alone suggest. The social dimension may matter even more. To move safely through large, harsh territories, people likely need stored information that no individual could gather alone in one lifetime. Which valleys are blocked in late winter, where another group usually camps during spring? Which crossing floods first, where suitable stone can be found after many days of travel? How far it is between reliable fuel sources? The transmission of route knowledge may be one of the greatest invisible achievements of Ice Age societies. Landscapes become inhabitable because they are remembered. A child born in one camp may grow into adulthood, carrying not just a territory, but a mental atlas of places never yet seen personally, learned through story, instruction, and repeated seasonal movement. In this sense, migration is cultural long before it becomes geographical. There is a strange irony in all this. The Ice Age narrows habitable space and yet enlarges the human world. It forces people into refuges and also exposes new lands. It cuts populations down and then offers corridors for dispersal. It makes movement more dangerous and, in some cases, more necessary. This dual character helps explain why human prehistory during the cold is full of both contraction and expansion. The same glacial system that drives some groups into demographic peril also creates the physical settings for later spread into new regions. One lesser-known detail helps illuminate this balance. In some regions, archaeologists find evidence not only of movement itself, but of repeated return to strategically valuable places, river confluences, high-quality stone sources, migratory bottlenecks, or sheltered terrace sites. This suggests that mobility is structured rather than chaotic. People are not drifting helplessly across a hostile continent. They are circulating through known nodes in a wider landscape network. Such nodes may become anchors for social memory, seasonal rendezvous, marriage exchange, ritual activity, or information transfer. Movement, then, is not the opposite of belonging. It is one way belonging is maintained. By the time these routes stretch from Western Eurasia deep into the east, and eventually toward the lands beyond Beringia, the species has already learned something profound. Survival does not always mean clinging to the least difficult place. Sometimes it means moving through difficulty with precision, using seasonal openings before they close. It means recognizing that a frozen river can be a road, that an exposed shelf can be habitable land, that a herd's migration can become a human corridor, that a coastline far from the modern sea can sustain life. The cold teaches geography brutally, but it teaches it well. And yet these routes do not pass through an empty human landscape. Even when Homo sapiens is spreading, adapting, and enduring, the world is still marked by the presence or the recent disappearance of other human kinds. Their traces overlap with ours. Their fate unfolds under many of the same climatic pressures. To understand why our species survives and expands, it is no longer enough to look only at ice, roots, and refuges. The question now turns toward those other humans who inhabit the edges of the same story, and toward the unsettling fact that while one lineage persists through the cold, others do not. The frozen world is crowded with ghosts. Even where Homo sapiens camps beside a hearth, follows reindeer across open ground, or stitches clothing against the wind. The story is not entirely its own. For much of the late Pleistocene, modern humans are not the only humans on Earth. Other lineages have lived across Eurasia for long spans of time, mastering landscapes, shaping tools, burying their dead, and enduring climates that would have crushed less adaptable creatures. By the time the cold reaches its hardest phase, some of these relatives are already gone, while others have only recently vanished from the record. Their absence hangs over the Ice Age like a second kind of silence. The same world that somehow carries Homo sapiens forward is also the world in which other humans disappear. Neanderthals are the most visible of these lost relatives, and for good reason. They occupy Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans become widespread there. They are not primitive caricatures waiting to be replaced by a superior successor. The evidence that has accumulated over the last several decades has made that older image impossible to sustain. Neanderthals are skilled hunters, capable tool makers, users of fire, and inhabitants of difficult environments including cold and highly seasonal ones. They are physically robust, with bodies in many cases well suited to conserving heat. They care for injured individuals. They produce symbolic objects in at least some contexts. They survive climatic oscillations long before the last glacial maximum ever arrives. If the Ice Age is a test of harsh living, Neanderthals are already veterans of it. That makes their disappearance more unsettling, not less. If a lineage so experienced in Eurasian cold can vanish, then survival cannot be reduced to a simple equation of toughness. Something more complicated is happening. Neanderthals do not vanish in one dramatic final winter. Their disappearance unfolds over time, unevenly across regions, during a period when climates fluctuate strongly and Homo sapiens spreads through Eurasia. In some places, the overlap between the two groups may be brief. In others, it may last longer. They do not live in separate mythic ages. They share landscapes, prey species, and in at least some cases genes. Most people living today outside Africa carry a small proportion of Neanderthal ancestry, proof that contact includes interbreeding, not just avoidance or violence. The record therefore resists any single story of simple replacement. Climate is part of the picture, but not the whole of it. Neanderthals had already endured cold conditions long before their final disappearance, so it would be misleading to claim that worsening climate alone suddenly defeated them. Yet climate instability likely matters. Rapid environmental shifts can fragment familiar habitats, alter prey distributions, and place greater pressure on small populations. If Neanderthal groups are regionally sparse and increasingly isolated, then even a lineage well adapted to local cold may become vulnerable to demographic decline. Small populations can lose resilience quickly. A few failed generations, reduced mate exchange, competition over shrinking refugial spaces, and the accumulation of ordinary risks can become decisive. Scholars still debate the relative weight of these pressures. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the timing and geography of Neanderthal disappearance. Competition with Homo sapiens almost certainly belongs somewhere in the answer, though competition itself may take many forms. It does not have to mean constant conflict in the dramatic sense. Two human species using similar prey, similar landscapes, and similar seasonal opportunities may influence one another simply by existing side by side. If modern humans maintain slightly wider social networks, slightly more flexible exchange systems, slightly more varied diets, or slightly greater demographic resilience, those advantages could accumulate over time without any need for a single overwhelming difference. The cold punishes narrow margins. A small edge, repeated across generations, can become the whole story. Technology may be part of that edge, though it must be handled carefully. There is no honest way to divide one human species into advanced and the other into primitive. Neanderthal technologies are sophisticated and effective within their contexts. At the same time, some later Homo sapiens populations in Eurasia display broader ranges of symbolic material, longer distance raw material transport, more visible ornamentation, and in certain contexts more diversified toolkits including items associated with fitted clothing or specialized hunting strategies. Whether these differences are decisive, merely correlated, or unevenly distributed remains debated. What survives in the record suggests that modern human populations often operate within somewhat broader social and material systems, but archaeology is always at risk of seeing what preserves best rather than what mattered most. Social scale may be more important than any single artifact. A lineage can be intelligent, skilled, and physically capable, yet still be vulnerable if its groups are too thinly scattered and too weakly connected. Larger and more durable networks can buffer local failures, move mates and knowledge across space, and allow quick recolonization of emptied territories. If Homo sapiens tends, on average, to sustain these wider networks more effectively, that could help explain why one lineage expands while another contracts. This is not a claim of destiny. It is a claim about probabilities in a dangerous world. The colder and more unstable the environment, the more strongly those probabilities may matter. There are other humans in the story too, though their outlines are dimmer. The Denisovans remain known primarily from sparse fossil remains and genetic traces, yet those traces reveal a lineage that contributes ancestry to later populations in Asia and Oceania. Their full geographic range and way of life are still being pieced together. They remind us that late Pleistocene Eurasia is not a simple two-player map. It is a braided human world with lineages overlapping, separating, mixing, and disappearing in ways the surviving evidence only partly captures. Some populations may have been so localized, or their remains so poorly preserved, that we know almost nothing about them except faint signals in genomes. The human past during the Great Cold is richer and stranger than the old simplified narrative allowed. For Homo sapiens living through this era, the presence of other humans may not always be visible as a grand historical drama. It may appear instead as rumour, caution, inherited memory, occasional encounter, a different style of tool found in a familiar valley, an abandoned hearth, a body seen at a distance, a dangerous meeting near a hunting ground, a rare exchange, or a child born later carrying ancestry from both sides. The emotional texture is lost to us, but the fact of contact is no longer in serious doubt. The frozen world does not separate humankinds perfectly. It brings them into relation. The disappearance of Neanderthals, in particular, therefore carries two truths at once. First, they are not simply defeated by nature while Homo sapiens triumphs over it. Nature is difficult for both. Climate stress applies to both. Second, modern humans are not isolated survivors standing cleanly apart from the vanished. They carry some of the vanished within them. The story is not one lineage erasing another without residue. It is more intimate than that. A human world of several branches narrows, but it does not narrow without exchange. This has consequences for how the Ice Age survival story is understood. It is tempting to treat Homo sapiens as the natural endpoint and everything else as a failed experiment. The record does not support such arrogance. Neanderthals survive enormous spans of time under difficult climatic conditions. Denisovan ancestry persists in living people. Other archaic populations almost certainly contribute to the complexity of the human picture in ways still unresolved. The fact that Homo sapiens remains in the end says something important, but it does not erase the competence of those who do not. Survival is not a morality tale. It is a demographic outcome shaped by ecology, connection, timing, and luck. Luck matters more than comfortable narratives admit. A population occupying the right refuge at the right time, maintaining the right exchange ties, or encountering the right environmental window may persist, where another equally intelligent and equally capable group does not. No single explanation fully accounts for why Homo sapiens becomes the last human species left standing. Climate change alone is insufficient. Technology alone is insufficient. Violence alone is insufficient. Interbreeding alone is insufficient. The answer seems to lie in combinations somewhat larger and more connected populations, flexible diets, adaptive movement, cumulative culture, symbolic and social cohesion, and the hard-to-measure role of chance acting on small numbers over long-time spans. There is a grim lesson in this. The Ice Age does not sort humans by worth. It sorts them by survivability under a shifting set of pressures. One lineage can be strong, intelligent, emotionally complex, and deeply adapted to its world, and still disappear. Another can survive not because it is perfect, but because it is slightly more flexible in slightly more places slightly more often. Under ordinary conditions, those margins may seem trivial. Under glacial stress, they become history. And once the other humans are gone, or nearly so, Homo sapiens inherits not a peaceful world, but a harsher kind of solitude. The old rivals, neighbours, and relatives recede into bone fragments, traces of DNA, and archaeological silence. The cold remains. The prey remains. The roots remain. But the human landscape has changed. From this point on, the burden of survival rests more heavily on one species alone. That burden is carried across a world still full of giant animals and improbable abundance in cold places. To understand why humans can continue where others vanish, it is not enough to look only at human competition. The ecosystem itself must be understood next. Because one of the strangest features of the Ice Age is that some of its bleakest landscapes are also capable of supporting extraordinary life. The Mammoth Steppe, which seems at first glance too barren for anything large to endure, turns out to be one of the key reasons humans can survive there at all. The Mammoth Steppe is one of the strangest landscapes the human species has ever depended on. It seems, at first glance, like the wrong kind of world for abundance. The air is cold, the winters are severe, trees are scarce across immense distances, and much of the ground lies under frost, seasonal ice, or wind-scoured dryness. By the standards of the modern imagination, such a place ought to be empty, cold, barren, nearly lifeless. Yet the evidence points in the opposite direction. Across broad stretches of late Pleistocene Eurasia, and in related forms elsewhere, this treeless world sustains extraordinary numbers of large animals. Mammoths move through it, so do horses, bison, reindeer, musk oxen in some regions, woolly rhinoceroses in parts of Eurasia, saiga antelope, wolves, foxes, and the predators that follow great herbivore concentrations. Human beings survive here not by defying the ecosystem, but by entering one that is unexpectedly productive in its own severe way. To understand why, it helps to abandon the assumption that warmth automatically equals richness. In many modern environments, thick forest suggests abundance, but that is not always true from the perspective of large grazing herbivores or the people who hunt them. Dense forest locks much of its productivity into wood, roots, and layered shade. It can be rich, but not always in forms easily converted into herds of large game. The Mammoth Steppe is different. Its productivity is spread low across the ground in grasses, sedges, herbs, and flowering plants adapted to cold, dryness, and short growing seasons. This vegetation may not look impressive in height, but it can be nutritionally valuable, especially when supported by summer light at high latitudes. During the warmer months, growth can be intense and rapid. What emerges is a vast grazing system, not lush in the tropical sense, but efficient in feeding large herbivores over enormous open territories. That system depends on a rare combination of conditions. The climate is cold enough to suppress forest expansion across wide areas, but often dry enough to avoid the waterlogging and deep snow that would make winter grazing impossible on a large scale. Wind matters too. Strong winds can scour snow from exposed ground, leaving forage accessible to animals that would struggle in heavier, more insulated snowpacks. Soils in some regions accumulate loess and other fine sediments, supporting plant communities unlike those of modern tundra. The result is a biome with no perfect modern equivalent part steppe, part tundra in some local expressions, but not fully either one. Scholars still debate how uniform this environment really is across its huge range and how best to classify its regional variations. The evidence remains incomplete, because any ecosystem reconstructed from pollen, plant macrofossils, isotopes, permafrost, and faunal remains will contain uncertainties. What survives in the record suggests, however, that this cold grassland world is real, extensive, and ecologically unusual. The large animals living within it are not incidental. They help shape the ecosystem as much as they benefit from it. Grazing, trampling, digging through snow, disturbing soil, dispersing nutrients, and suppressing woody growth all contribute to maintaining open landscapes. Mammoths, in particular, may have had ecosystem-level effects simply through size and feeding behavior, though the exact scale of that influence is still debated. Herds do not merely consume a ready-made steppe. They participate in keeping it open. This creates a feedback loop. Open vegetation supports herbivores. Herbivores reinforce open vegetation. Predators and scavengers then build their lives around the moving edges of that abundance. Human beings enter into this loop not as outside observers, but as another large, socially coordinated predator reading the same landscape. That is why the mammoth steppe matters so much to the story of survival. It provides a solution to a problem that otherwise seems overwhelming. A cold world can kill humans through caloric deficit long before freezing alone finishes the job. To live at high latitudes or in severe continental climates, people need large, reliable energy sources. The steppe offers them in animal form. Herd animals convert scattered vegetation into fat, muscle, marrow, hide, antler, and bone. They concentrate the landscape's productivity into bodies humans can hunt, process, transport, and use almost completely. A reindeer herd or a horse band is not simply prey. It is stored grass transformed into human survival. This helps explain why some of the bleakest-looking regions become central to human life. Open horizons that appear empty from a modern viewpoint are, in ecological terms, legible and potentially rich. People can see movement at distance. They can anticipate herd pathways. They can position themselves at crossings, bottlenecks, and seasonal grazing grounds. In forests, prey can vanish into cover. In steppe, it leaves readable traces in snow, soil, dung, and disrupted vegetation. Wind can be punishing, but visibility can be an advantage. Human hunters thrive not only where food exists, but where food can be predicted. The mammoth itself, looming over this entire biome, is almost too iconic to handle carefully. It invites exaggeration. In popular imagination, it becomes either the essential prey of Ice Age people or a symbol too large to mean anything specific. The reality is more measured. Mammoths are important, sometimes very important, and in certain places their bones, ivory, and meat clearly matter to human groups. Some settlements in Eastern Europe preserve mammoth remains in ways that suggest repeated use for structure, fuel, or concentrated butchery. Ivory becomes material for tools, ornaments, and artistic work. But mammoths are not the whole economy. Reindeer often appear more consistently crucial in many regions. Horses, bison, and other herbivores may be more frequent prey depending on place and period. The mammoth steppe is named for its largest emblem, but human survival rests on a broader web of animal use. Still, the mammoth's importance is not only practical, it embodies the scale of the ecosystem itself. A landscape capable of sustaining such animals cannot be dismissed as barren. That is one reason the mammoth steppe remains such a powerful correction to modern assumptions. We tend to associate abundance with warmth, forests, and water-rich fertility. The late Pleistocene reveals another possibility: a cold, dry, open world capable of concentrating life into immense grazing systems. No single explanation fully accounts for why this biome is as productive as it appears in some reconstructions, and scholars continue to test different models involving climate, soils, grazing pressure, and seasonal light. But the broad fact remains: this ecosystem gives humans something they desperately need: enough large prey, moving through enough predictable space to make prolonged occupation possible. There is a deeper mystery here as well. Why does this world disappear if the mammoth steppe is so successful? Why is there no true modern equivalent stretching across Eurasia today? Part of the answer lies in the ending of the Ice Age. As temperatures rise, moisture regimes shift, forests advance in many regions, snow conditions change, and the ecological balance that maintains vast, open grazing systems begins to break down. Large herbivore communities reorganize or collapse. Some species retreat northward, others go extinct. The giant cold-adapted ecosystem fragments into tundra, forest, meadow, wetland, and more localized grasslands. In that sense, the mammoth steppe is not only a survival stage, it is a vanished world, one whose disappearance will later force humans into new ways of living. But during the coldest period, it is still intact enough to matter decisively. For the people inside it, that ecosystem is experienced through movement, danger, and seasonal knowledge. A valley where reindeer funnel in autumn becomes a site of opportunity and memory. A plain where horse bands graze after thaw becomes worth revisiting. A place rich in mammoth bone, whether through hunting, scavenging, or natural accumulation exploited later by humans, becomes a source of shelter material and fuel where wood is scarce. The steppe is not uniformly generous. It gives in pulses. It may sustain large herbivores overall, yet leave hunters hungry if timing is wrong or weather disrupts patterns. Storms, deep snow in certain years, and shifting migration routes can still turn a promising territory into a deadly one. The abundance of the mammoth steppe is real, but it is not easy abundance. It must be interpreted correctly. That interpretive skill may be one of the greatest human advantages. The ecosystem does not announce itself in simple terms. A modern traveller dropped into it without inherited knowledge might see only cold and distance. Ice Age people see signs: the slope where snow lies thinner, the corridor where tracks converge, the sheltered rise where a camp can be placed downwind of a likely route, the quality of dung, the condition of vegetation at the edge of thaw, the meaning of hoof marks over older crust. In this sense, the mammoth steppe mystery is not only ecological, it is cognitive. It is a world whose value exists fully only for those who know how to read it. That reading extends beyond hunting. Herbivore-rich environments also attract predators and scavengers, and humans must live among them. Wolves, big cats in some regions, hyenas in earlier or more southern contexts, and other carnivores are drawn to carcasses and herd routes. Competition for the same animal wealth can be dangerous. A successful kill brings food, but it also creates risk. Camps must be protected, fires must be maintained, carcasses must be processed quickly. The openness of the steppe helps hunters see prey, but it also leaves them visible. Survival in this ecosystem means sharing the landscape with other intelligent and capable consumers of flesh. One lesser-known aspect of the mammoth steppe is how much of its human record may be biased by preservation. Cold conditions help preserve bones, and in some areas even organic materials. But the visible archaeological sites may still represent only certain kinds of use-kill sites, dwellings, repeatedly occupied nodes, while much of daily movement leaves almost nothing behind. This can create the illusion that people appear only at dramatic moments. In truth, the steppe must have been threaded with ordinary activity: scouting, repairing, teaching, waiting, following, carrying, testing the ground, making camp, breaking camp. Like all survival landscapes, it is built as much from repetition as from spectacle. In the end, the mammoth steppe explains something that otherwise seems nearly impossible. Human beings can live through deep cold not simply because they are clever enough to endure exposure, but because the ecosystem around them, strange though it is, offers a usable flow of energy. It is cold, dry, exposed, and dangerous. It is also productive, patterned, and legible enough to support large prey and the people who depend on them. Without that unusual biome, the map of human survival in the last glacial maximum would likely be far smaller. But ecosystems leave traces, and those traces are all that remain once the herds move on, the camps collapse, and the people themselves vanish into ancestry. To understand the mammoth steppe and the lives lived within it, we have to turn next to the evidence buried under ice, soil, and bone. The world of the Great Cold does not speak directly. It has to be reconstructed from fragments, and those fragments are among the most remarkable clues science has ever learned to read. The world of the Great Cold survives only in fragments, and most of those fragments do not look important at first. A cylinder of ice pulled from Greenland or Antarctica, a smear of pollen sealed in lake mud, a cut mark on bone so fine it becomes visible only under magnification, a campsite detected not by walls or roofs, but by changes in soil colour, the scatter of napped stone, and the chemistry of ancient ash, a tooth, a bead, a strand of preserved fibre, a few grams of sediment carrying traces of DNA from bodies long gone. None of this resembles the past as people normally imagine it. There is no complete scene waiting underground to be uncovered whole. There are only clues, often broken, often displaced, often maddeningly incomplete. And yet from these thin remains, scientists have learned to reconstruct one of the harshest human worlds that ever existed. Ice cores are among the most extraordinary of these archives. In their layered depths, year upon year of snowfall is compressed into a record of atmosphere itself. Tiny bubbles trap ancient air. Isotopes preserve temperature signals. Dust reveals windiness and aridity. Volcanic ash marks distant eruptions. Soot, salts, and chemical traces hint at changes in circulation across continents and oceans. When researchers examine these long-frozen columns, they are not merely looking at old ice. They are reading the pulse of the planet through time. The harshest phases of the last glacial period appear there as colder isotopic signatures, altered greenhouse gas concentrations, and dustier intervals that speak of drier, windier landscapes. The record is not perfect and not always easy to connect directly to local human experience, but it establishes the broad environmental frame with tremendous precision. The coldest period humans somehow lived through is not an impressionistic story. It is anchored in physical evidence drawn straight from ancient atmosphere. Lake sediments and peat deposits add another layer to the picture. Pollen grains, astonishingly durable for something so small, drift into water and become buried in quiet layers over thousands of years. Under the microscope, they reveal changing plant communities, grasses replacing forest in one interval, steppe herbs flourishing in another, trees returning later as the climate warms, spores, charcoal fragments, insect remains, and geochemical signals join the pollen to show shifts in moisture, fire, and local ecology. From this, paleobotanists can reconstruct landscapes that no person will ever see directly again. A valley now wooded may once have been dry open steppe. A lake bed now farmed may once have caught the dust of glacial winds. The evidence remains incomplete because pollen travels unevenly, and local records can be hard to generalize. But across many sites the pattern becomes strong. The world was colder, drier in many places, and ecologically transformed in ways that fit the broader glacial story. Then there are the animal bones, perhaps the most intimate evidence of all, because they record the point where climate, ecosystem, and human action meet. A bone can show species, age at death, season of killing in some cases, and whether it was butchered, burned, broken for marrow, gnawed by carnivores, or left intact. Cut marks from stone tools reveal where flesh was removed. Spiral fractures suggest fresh breakage for marrow extraction. Burning patterns hint at cooking or disposal. Concentrations of certain body parts suggest whether humans killed animals on site or transported selected portions from elsewhere. Stable isotopes in bone collagen can reveal diet and environment, while tooth wear and growth layers sometimes offer clues about seasonality. It is easy to overlook how much information resides in a single fragment if the right questions are asked. A campsite is often reconstructed less from dramatic artifacts than from the careful reading of broken bone. Human bones, rarer and far more emotionally charged, add their own set of clues. Body proportions can hint at adaptation to climate, though such interpretations must be cautious and never simplistic. Teeth preserve chemical information about childhood diet and movement. Ancient DNA extracted from bones or teeth has revolutionized the field, allowing researchers to trace ancestry, interbreeding, population turnovers, and deep genetic relationships invisible to earlier archaeology. Sometimes a single finger bone, tooth, or skull fragment changes the map of human history. The Denisovans become known largely through remains so sparse they would once have seemed almost useless. Neanderthal and modern human interactions become clearer through genome data that reveal contact no excavation alone could fully prove. Genetic evidence has also begun to show population contractions, expansions, and replacements across glacial Eurasia. Yet even here caution matters. DNA preserves only under favourable conditions, and the sample is always partial. Whole populations may remain unsampled, whole stories may still be missing. One of the strangest advances in recent years is sedimentary DNA, the recovery of genetic traces directly from dirt. In some caves and deposits, sediments carry fragments of DNA left behind by humans, animals, and plants that may not even be represented by visible bones. This means a place can sometimes testify to its occupants even when the bodies themselves are absent. It is an extraordinary development, but it also makes the record more complex. A cave might preserve traces from many species across multiple occupations, forcing careful interpretation. What survives in the record suggests enormous promise, but also the need for restraint. The past is becoming more visible, yet not necessarily simpler. Stone tools remain the classic language of Paleolithic archaeology, and for good reason. Stone preserves where almost everything else decays, but even here, the real story is subtler than a row of projectile points in a display case. The way stone is selected, prepared, struck, retouched, and transported reveals planning depth, skill, and social tradition. Different technological industries across Upper Paleolithic Eurasia are not just collections of shapes. They are learned systems passed from person to person, generation to generation. A blade core tells of preparation, a finely retouched point hints at specialized hunting. Microscopic wear on an edge can show whether it cut meat, scraped hide, carved bone, or worked plant fibers. Residue analysis can sometimes reveal adhesives or traces of hafting. Through such methods, the dead routine of ancient labor becomes partially visible again. A scraper once held in a cold hand, used to soften hide beside a fire, survives as stone long after the hand is gone. Organic materials, when they do survive, bring the Ice Age startlingly close. Needles of bone or ivory imply tailored clothing. Twisted fibers hint at cordage. Worked antler shows complex tool production. Ivory beads and pendants reveal ornamentation that would be easy to underestimate in a purely survival-focused story. In frozen or exceptionally dry conditions, preservation can become almost miraculous, capturing details that ordinarily vanish: traces of woven materials, wooden shafts, plant remains, even footprints in rare cases. Such finds are uncommon, which makes them disproportionately valuable. They reveal how much of ordinary life is missing from most sites. For every preserved needle, there were surely many others. For every surviving fibre, countless garments are lost forever. Caves and rock shelters preserve human traces especially well, which is both a gift and a distortion. They give archaeologists layered occupations, protected sediments, and recurring use zones that can be excavated carefully over time. But humans do not live only in caves, and the prominence of cave sites in the record can mislead. Open-air sites on steppe, river terraces, exposed shelves, and seasonal camps may preserve poorly or be destroyed entirely by erosion, frost action, or later burial. This means the record of glacial life is always biased towards certain kinds of places. The evidence remains incomplete not only because time has erased things, but because some landscapes were never equally likely to preserve them. Underwater prehistoric coastlines are especially important in this respect. Rising seas have hidden large portions of the Ice Age human world beneath later oceans, taking with them camps, shore routes, estuaries, and fishing places we can only partly infer. Dating methods help hold all these fragments in sequence. Radiocarbon dating, when organic material survives, provides age estimates for many Upper Paleolithic sites, though calibration is necessary and older samples become increasingly difficult. Other methods, such as luminescence dating, uranium series dating in some contexts, or stratigraphic correlation with known climatic events, extend the range of what can be placed in time. Without chronology, archaeology is only a collection of disconnected scenes. With it, patterns emerge: occupations clustering during milder intervals, regions thinning out during cold peaks, technologies appearing and spreading, populations retreating and later re-expanding. The dates are not always neat, and specialists often argue over them because a few centuries can matter enormously at this scale. But without such arguments, the broad narrative would remain guesswork rather than science. Sometimes the most powerful clues are the least dramatic. A repeated hearth location within a shelter suggests social organization in space. A concentration of red ochre points to symbolic practice, hide processing, or both. The orientation of animal bones around a dwelling may reveal refuse habits or wind patterns. Tiny fish bones can shift assumptions about diet. The age profile of hunted animals can reveal whether people are intercepting migratory herds, targeting vulnerable individuals, or taking what they can get under pressure. Footwear impressions in rare preserved surfaces can suggest movement and body size. In archaeology, grandeur often emerges from accumulation rather than spectacle. This is why the reconstruction of Ice Age life has become such a multidisciplinary enterprise. Climate scientists, geneticists, archaeologists, zooarchaeologists, paleobotanists, geochemists, and specialists in ancient environments all contribute different fragments of the same world. None can solve it alone. An ice core can reveal global cooling, but not how a family arranged a winter shelter. A campsite can reveal butchery, but not the full regional climate. DNA can reveal ancestry, but not exactly how a route was travelled or a garment sewn. No single explanation fully accounts for the human survival story because no single archive contains the whole of it. The truth has to be built across scales, from microscopic traces to continental systems, And even then, uncertainty remains. This is not a weakness in the field, it is part of intellectual honesty. Scholars still debate site interpretations, migration timing, the intensity of bottlenecks, the exact nature of the mammoth steppe, the role of coastal routes, the degree of continuity between populations, and the significance of symbolic artifacts under harsh climatic conditions. New finds regularly change old assumptions. A cave once thought to represent one culture turns out to contain deeper complexity. A genome overturns a tidy model of replacement. A sediment core shifts the timing of environmental change. The Ice Age refuses to become simple, yet enough survives to say something remarkable with confidence. Human beings live through the Great Cold in worlds reconstructed from ice, dust, pollen, bone, and scattered fire. Their presence is not imagined into existence. It is there in cut marks, in beads, in dwellings, in stone edges dulled by hide scraping, in children's teeth, in animal marrow cracked open by practiced hands, in ancient DNA, clinging to bone and sediment. The evidence is fragmentary, but the life behind it is unmistakable. Once all these clues are gathered, the next question becomes unavoidable. If humans do survive this climate, and if the evidence for their endurance is real, then why exactly does that survival happen? Was it technology above all social cooperation? Flexible diets, movement, refuge, luck? The fragments do not point to one answer. They point to many, and that is where the argument becomes most interesting. Because the survival of our species through the deepest cold may not rest on any single strength at all. By the time the clues have been assembled, ice cores, pollen, bones, tools, genomes, dwellings, drowned coastlines, vanished herds, the urge to find one decisive answer becomes almost irresistible. Humans survive the coldest period, so there must have been some key trait, some breakthrough, some special advantage that made the difference. Better tools, perhaps, better minds, better cooperation, better clothing, better luck. The problem is that the evidence refuses to settle obediently around a single explanation. Every answer that looks convincing on its own begins to weaken when stretched across the full range of glacial worlds humans inhabit. The species survives not in one place, by one method, under one fixed set of conditions, but across a shifting planet of refuges, steppe corridors, cold river valleys, exposed shelves, and unstable climates. No single explanation fully accounts for that. Technology is usually the first candidate, and for obvious reasons. Without fire, tailored clothing, durable stone tools, hafted weapons, hide working, and shelters adapted to severe conditions, much of Ice Age survival would become difficult to imagine. A bone needle may look small in a museum case, but it carries the weight of whole winters. A reliable blade technology changes butchery, hide preparation, and weapon maintenance. Composite tools make hunting more effective and efficient. Fire, managed well, turns darkness into working time and frozen flesh into edible food. There is no sensible version of the story in which technology does not matter enormously, and yet technology alone cannot explain everything. Neanderthals also possess sophisticated tool traditions and mastery of fire, and still disappear. Human groups with similar basic toolkits do not all survive equally well in all places. Tools are essential, but they do not operate by themselves. They have to be taught, maintained, repaired, and integrated into social life. Cooperation follows close behind as the next great explanation, and here too the case is strong. No human being survives deep glacial cold alone for long. Children need extended care. injuries require support, large prey often requires coordinated hunting and transport. Knowledge must be shared. Food has to move through social channels if bad luck is not to become fatal. In sparse populations, wider alliance networks may be as important as the immediate family group. Social connection can buffer hunger, facilitate mate exchange, preserve information, and allow recovery after local failure. The more severe the world becomes, the more costly isolation is likely to be. This makes cooperation look almost fundamental, and perhaps it is. But cooperation itself is not a magic solution. Small groups can still collapse despite strong internal bonds if prey disappears, if climate shifts too quickly, or if the wider network fails. Sociality helps survival, but it does not guarantee it. Then there is flexibility, which may be less dramatic than technology and less visible than cooperation, but perhaps even more important. Human beings survive the Great Cold partly because they are not locked into a single ecological script. They can hunt reindeer in one region, fish in another, exploit horse and bison elsewhere, move toward coasts when terrestrial resources fail, retreat into refugia, expand when corridors open, and alter seasonal routines when conditions change. They can make use of caves where caves exist and build shelters where they do not. They can transport stone, imitate successful practices, and, over generations, shift their entire geographical range. This flexibility is not a vague human virtue. It is a concrete behavioral capacity visible in archaeological diversity. Different places show different adaptations, and that may be the point. A species with only one reliable way of living would likely have failed in a world this unstable. Homo sapiens survives in part because it can survive differently. Dietary breadth belongs inside that flexibility. The old image of Ice Age people relying almost entirely on a few spectacular large mammals has steadily become harder to defend in absolute terms. Large herbivores are often central, but many human groups also use smaller game, fish, birds, gathered plant foods, and regionally specific resources whenever they are available and worth the effort. In harsh climates, this breadth can make the difference between temporary shortage and total collapse. A society that can shift from one prey base to another, or exploit aquatic foods in addition to terrestrial ones, may be far better buffered against climatic swings than one overly dependent on a narrow hunting niche. The evidence varies by region and preservation, and scholars still debate the relative importance of broad-spectrum strategies during different Upper Paleolithic intervals. What survives in the record suggests that diversity of subsistence is often an advantage, even in environments where large game dominates the visible archaeological story. Some researchers place special emphasis on information on the ability not just to make tools or hunt effectively, but to accumulate and transmit practical knowledge across generations. This explanation has a great deal of force. The Ice Age world is not only cold, it is changeable. Routes open and close, herds shift, snow conditions vary, coastlines move, refugia fill and thin. In such a world, knowledge is survival stored outside the body, knowing where fuel can still be found after early snow, when a river crossing is safe, which valley remains passable in late winter, or how to sew the kind of clothing that prevents deadly heat loss may matter more than physical strength. Cultural learning lets humans adapt faster than biological evolution alone could manage. This may be one of the decisive differences between our species and a less behaviourally flexible rival. And yet even this answer cannot stand alone. Information must have social systems to carry it, and material conditions to make use of it. Demography also pushes itself into the argument. Larger, more connected populations are harder to erase than smaller, more isolated ones. They are more likely to preserve innovation, recover from local extinctions, maintain mate exchange, and recolonize empty territory. If Homo sapiens tends, on average, to sustain larger or more interconnected populations than competing human lineages, that could help explain long-term survival. A group may be skilled, but if it is too small and too cut off, every accident counts more heavily. Genetic evidence, archaeological distribution, and comparative modelling all suggest that demographic resilience may be one of the hidden foundations of endurance. Yet demography itself is partly an outcome of other strengths. Better cooperation, broader diets, stronger networks, and flexible movement help create viable population size in the first place. The explanations loop into one another. Environmental luck cannot be excluded either, uncomfortable though that may be. Histories of survival are often written as if success must reflect superior adaptation in a morally satisfying way. The Ice Age does not offer that kind of comfort. A group occupying a favourable refugium at the right time may persist where another, equally intelligent and equally competent group is trapped in a worsening corridor. A river valley may remain rich one century and fail the next. An exposed shelf may open a route for one population, while another faces isolation behind advancing ecological barriers. Chance event storms, disease, local prey crashes, random demographic losses matter more when populations are small. Luck alone does not explain the species-wide outcome. But to remove luck entirely would be to smooth the past into something it was not. Survival under glacial stress is not cleanly meritocratic. There is also the possibility that symbolic life and identity contribute more than they first appear to. Ornamentation, ritual attention to the dead, shared visual traditions, and markers of affiliation may look secondary beside hunger and cold, but they may help hold social systems together across distance and time. A symbol can signal belonging. Belonging can regulate marriage and alliance. Alliance can move knowledge and resources. Resource movement can buffer climate stress. In this way, what appears decorative may be infrastructural. Scholars still debate the exact social role of symbolic material in the Upper Paleolithic, because the meanings are largely unrecoverable and the evidence is selective. Still, what survives in the record suggests that humans living under severe conditions continue to invest in symbols, and that persistence is unlikely to be meaningless. When all these explanations are weighed together, the real answer begins to look less like a single cause and more like a layered system. Technology extends the body. Cooperation extends the individual into the group. Knowledge extends the present into the future. Flexibility extends survival across different ecologies. Demography extends local endurance into species-level persistence. Symbolic life extends trust and belonging beyond immediate necessity. Luck, meanwhile, moves quietly through all of it, amplifying one advantage here, erasing another there. Remove any one layer entirely and the structure weakens. Remove several and it may fail. This is why arguments over the one true reason humans survived the Ice Age often go astray. They mistake a braided process for a singular one. The Great Cold does not ask only whether humans are intelligent. It asks whether they are intelligent in groups, whether those groups remain connected, whether knowledge travels, whether prey can still be found, whether movement is possible, whether technology is maintained, whether children live long enough to inherit what matters, whether enough chance favors enough people often enough to keep the whole chain unbroken. The species survives because the answer, across many places and many generations, is repeatedly yes. But the answer is not yes everywhere. That may be the most important correction. Some groups fail, some vanish, some regions empty out, some traditions are lost. What we call human survival is the sum of many local survivals and many local extinctions, stitched together across time. The enduring line is real, but it is built from breaks. That is why the final explanation has to remain modest. Homo sapiens does not pass through the coldest period because it is invincible. It passes through because it is versatile, social, cumulative, and fortunate enough, often enough, to keep going when the world becomes brutally selective. And then the world changes again. The great cold does not last forever. The ice begins, unevenly and restlessly, to retreat. Seas will rise. Forest will return in many places. The mammoth steppe will fragment. Old roots will drown. Refugia will empty outward. The ending of the cold might sound like a simple rescue, but it is not. For people shaped by glacial life, warming brings its own instability, its own losses, and its own hard decisions. Surviving the deepest freeze is one achievement. Surviving the world that comes after it is another. The first signs are subtle enough to be mistaken for local change. A valley stays open a little longer in spring. Meltwater runs harder than it did in remembered years. Snowline and ice margin begin to shift, not dramatically at first, but enough that old travel assumptions start to feel less certain. A marsh appears where firm ground used to hold. In another place, a familiar crossing becomes dangerous earlier in the season. The air softens, but the world does not become simpler. That is the great misunderstanding of deglaciation. It is tempting to imagine the ending of the cold as relief, a release from pressure, a frozen prison finally unlocked. For the people living through it, the truth is more unstable. The cold begins to break, and with it the entire map of survival starts moving again. On the larger scale, the great ice sheets begin to lose their hold. Rising temperatures weaken the long glacial regime. Ice retreats from some margins, thins in others, and sends increasing meltwater into river systems and oceans. Sea level, so long suppressed by water locked in continental ice, starts its long climb upward. This happens over millennia rather than in one single flood. But within human timescales, the consequences can still be dramatic. Coastlines shift landward. River mouths migrate. Estuaries form where open plains once stretched. Wetlands expand. Expose shelves that may have carried game. Camps and movement corridors begin, slowly and then decisively, to disappear beneath the rising sea. What had once been a broad world of cold land starts to drown. In retrospect, this sounds like the return of a familiar earth. To those inside it, it is the erasure of remembered ground. The ecological consequences are just as profound. In many regions, warming brings more moisture as well as higher temperatures. Trees begin to spread into spaces long dominated by open steppe and tundra-like vegetation. Shrub cover thickens. The mammoth steppe, that strange and enormously consequential cold grassland system, starts to fragment. The exact pace varies by region, and scholars still debate how uniform or abrupt these changes are in different landscapes. The evidence remains incomplete and often highly local, but the broader pattern is clear. The cold world that supports vast herds of grazing animals begins to reorganize, not all at once, not everywhere, and not without reversals, but enough to matter deeply. The very ecosystem that helps humans endure the great cold now starts to become less stable. This does not mean the end of the life. It means the end of a particular kind of life. Open country hunters who have long relied on large herd animals moving across wide, visible spaces now face encroaching woodland, altered migration routes, new wetlands, new seasonal rhythms, and prey communities that no longer behave in the old ways. Reindeer may shift range. Horse and bison distributions may change. Mammoth populations, already under pressure in many areas, decline further as the ecological matrix that favours them contracts. Some giant herbivores disappear from wide regions entirely. Others survive only in reduced and shifting habitats. Human beings do not stand outside this process. Their knowledge is still valuable, but parts of it are now knowledge of a vanishing world. One of the hardest truths about environmental change is that adaptation to one successful system can become a liability when that system breaks apart. People who know how to live on the mammoth steppe are not automatically well placed to thrive in spreading forest, broken wetland, or reshaped coasts. Their skills are not useless, far from it, but the balance changes. Visibility decreases in many regions as woodland advances. Herd intercept hunting may become less reliable. Different prey requires different timing, tools, and tactics. River corridors may become richer in some resources and more dangerous in others. Fishing, trapping, broader spectrum gathering, and intensive use of smaller animals may become more important in some places. The world is warming, but it is not offering a simple gift. It is demanding another adaptation. The instability of this transition is one reason the end of the Ice Age is so difficult to narrate as a smooth story. Climate does not rise evenly into comfort. There are oscillations, abrupt reversals, regional shocks, and episodes of startling rapid change. In parts of the Northern Hemisphere, the late glacial period includes dramatic warmings and setbacks that alter vegetation and hydrology within spans short enough to matter to oral memory. Rivers change course, lakes expand or drain, permafrost retreats, slopes become unstable. In some places, massive meltwater pulses likely reorganize whole drainage systems. Scholars still debate the exact human consequences of particular events, because archaeological chronologies and local environmental sequences do not always line up neatly. But no single explanation fully accounts for late glacial survival without recognizing the world's volatility. The cold begins to break, and the result is not calm, it is turbulence. Rising sea levels are among the most transformative parts of this turbulence. During the glacial maximum, lower seas expose routes, plains, and productive coastal margins that shape human movement across continents. As the oceans return, those landscapes are lost. Beringia narrows and is eventually drowned. The plains of Sunderland fragment back into islands. Shelf worlds around Europe and elsewhere are inundated, taking with them campsites, river valleys, estuaries, and perhaps entire chapters of human adaptation that now lie underwater. For people living through this slow drowning, the sea is not reclaiming abstract geology. It is advancing into habitable land. Old landmarks vanish. Familiar routes fail. Productive zones move. Generations may watch coastlines retreat inland farther than grandparents would have thought possible. Inland, the retreat of ice brings hazards of its own. Glacial lakes can form behind unstable ice or sediment dams. Meltwater floods may carve new channels with immense force. Newly exposed land is not always ready for easy occupation. Some areas remain raw, wet, sediment-rich, and difficult. Others become attractive quickly, drawing animals and humans into spaces that were previously unreachable. The opening of these lands creates both opportunity and danger. A valley freed from ice may offer new grazing and new routes, but also rockfall, unstable rivers, and unpredictable soils. Deglaciation is not the simple restoration of a habitable world. It is the creation of a new one through disorder. Human populations respond in different ways, which is exactly what one would expect by now. Some groups expand into territories previously too cold or too close to ice margins to sustain long-term use. Others are forced to alter deeply rooted seasonal patterns as prey and vegetation change. Refugial populations begin to move outward. Regions once sparsely occupied fill in. Technologies shift. Settlement structures shift. In some places, continuity is visible beneath the change. In others, discontinuity dominates. The archaeological record can make this look tidier than it really was, because it preserves sites and sequences rather than lived confusion. But confusion is likely what many people experience. A world inherited from ancestors no longer behaves like itself. There is an emotional dimension to this, difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. Much of human memory in glacial landscapes must have been place-based. A crossing, a valley, a camp, a hunting ground, a spring thaw, a migratory timing. These form the skeleton of practical life. When environmental change accelerates, those remembered certainties begin to fail. The old route is water now. The herd no longer arrives when expected. The sheltered basin is marsh. The open horizon has filled with shrubs and trees. One generation's knowledge becomes partially obsolete in the lifetime of the next. That is not merely an economic problem. It is cultural shock. The evidence cannot tell us exactly how people felt, but what survives in the record suggests a repeated need to adjust, improvise, and sometimes abandon ways of living that had once worked brilliantly. The warming world also reshapes human competition and connection. As habitable zones expand in some directions and contract in others, populations may encounter each other in new ways. Newly opened territories attract movement. Drowned coasts compress some communities inland. Changing prey distributions alter the value of particular river systems and ecotones. In some regions, this may create opportunities for exchange and expansion. In others, it may intensify conflict over transitional landscapes especially rich in resources. As always, the evidence remains incomplete. But late glacial change almost certainly affects not only where people live, but how densely and with whom. One lesser known but important point is that warming can, in certain contexts, increase unpredictability more than it increases comfort. Modern intuition often assumes that higher temperature simply means a more forgiving world. Yet for hunters and foragers adapted to a glacial regime, predictability may matter as much as average warmth. A cold, open plain with stable migratory rhythms may be easier to work than a patchier, warming landscape in ecological transition. The end of the Great Cold therefore brings a paradox. Conditions become less extreme in one sense, but more uncertain in another. The old world was hard, the new one is unstable. This is where the story of survival becomes especially revealing. Humans do not merely outlast the deepest cold, and then step gratefully into ease. They survive the collapse of the cold world too. They retool, redirect, and reinterpret the land once again. The same qualities that carry them through glacial severity cooperation, cultural learning, movement, flexibility now carry them through climatic transformation. A species adapted not to one fixed environment, but to change itself proves, once more, why it remains. But the cost should not be softened. The warming does not save the mammoth steppe. It does not preserve the giant herbivore world intact. It does not keep coastlines where they were. It does not spare every population from dislocation. What it does is force a transition from one human age into another. The Great Cold begins to loosen, and in doing so it breaks the old geography that made glacial survival possible. The end of the Ice Age is therefore not a conclusion, it is a threshold. On the far side of that threshold, the survivors begin to remake the world. They move into new lands, fill ecological spaces opened by retreating ice, adapt to forests and coasts and changing rivers, and lay down the human patterns from which much later history will grow. The cold has shaped them. Now they carry that inheritance forward into a planet no longer frozen in the same way, but still marked everywhere by what the ice once was. The survivors do not step into a blank world. They step into a world made newly available, newly unstable, and full of traces left by the cold they have endured. Ice withdraws, seas rise, forests spread, grasslands contract in some regions and persist in others, and human beings begin to occupy territories that would have been impossible or pointless to use during the glacial maximum. This outward movement is one of the great transformations of prehistory, but it is not a clean beginning. It is the reorganization of a species already shaped by hardship. The people who enter these changing landscapes carry with them more than tools and bodies. They carry a way of reading environments, a habit of movement, a deep reliance on social memory, and an inherited capacity to survive under pressure. In that sense, the world after the deepest cold is remade by people who have already been remade themselves. Across Europe, one of the most obvious consequences of warming is recolonization. Regions long compressed by ice, periglacial severity, or ecological barrenness become usable again, though usable remains a moving target. New vegetation spreads northward and uphill. River systems change, animal communities reassemble. Human populations that had persisted in southern or otherwise favorable refuges begin to move outward into territories their ancestors could not stably occupy during the harshest glacial phases. This is not a single wave, it is a complex process of expansion, local adaptation, and repeated adjustment as climate continues to fluctuate. Archaeology preserves changing tool traditions, settlement patterns, and regional lifeways that suggest not just population growth, but the filling in of a once fragmented map. That expansion matters because it transforms the scale of human presence. During the coldest intervals, much of the stories about contraction, refuge, and low-density endurance. Afterward, larger portions of the continent support sustained occupation. Blank spaces shrink, connections widen. Areas once visited only intermittently may become seasonal anchors, then long-term territories. The human world becomes thicker, networks grow more elaborate, resources diversify. This does not mean life becomes easy, but it does mean that the species begins to convert survival into spread. What had been a chain of narrow passages becomes, gradually, a broader human geography. The ecological basis of that geography changes too. In many regions, broad open steppe gives way to more wooded and varied landscapes. That forces hunting traditions to adapt. Forest prey behaves differently from herd animals on open plains. Visibility shrinks, tracking changes, ambush, trapping, fishing, gathering, and smaller-scale mobility may increase in importance relative to the long-distance pursuit systems of the mammoth steppe. Some large, cold-adapted animals retreat or vanish. Others remain but in altered distributions. Human groups respond by broadening diets in many areas, making more intensive use of aquatic foods, woodland resources, birds, small mammals, nuts, roots, and local ecotones. The transformation is not uniform, and scholars still debate how quickly these changes unfold in different places. The evidence remains incomplete, but the long trend is unmistakable. The survivors do not preserve the glacial way of life unchanged. They diversify it. Coasts become increasingly important in this remade world. As sea levels rise, shorelines migrate inland, but they also generate new estuaries, tidal zones, lagoons, and marine margins rich in food. Fishing and shellfish use become more visible in many later prehistoric records, though the earlier stages of this shift are often hidden by drowned landscapes. What survives on land may only hint at how substantial some of these coastal adaptations become. The end of the Ice Age, therefore, does two things at once. It erases older shelf worlds and creates new maritime opportunities. Human beings, characteristically, exploit both when they can. They follow rivers to the sea, settle near productive waters, and begin orienting parts of their lives around environments that glacial low sea levels had arranged very differently. Population growth likely accelerates in many regions as climates stabilize enough, at least for stretches, to support denser and more continuous occupation. Greater density has consequences beyond simple numbers. It can preserve innovation more effectively, sustain more frequent exchange, support more specialized regional traditions, and create the social conditions from which later complexity eventually grows. One must be careful not to turn this into a teleological story leading neatly toward farming, states, or civilization, as though those outcomes were inevitable. They were not. But it is fair to say that surviving the deep cold leaves Homo sapiens in possession of a broad inhabited world and a toolkit of adaptive behaviors that make future expansions possible. The species emerges from the glacial age not unscarred, but capable of building on what it has learned. That learning is not merely technical, it is cognitive and social. Ice Age survival selects, in a broad cultural sense, for communities that can preserve information, teach flexibly, cooperate across distance, and respond to environmental instability without total collapse. Those capacities do not disappear when the climate warms. They remain embedded in human behavior. A group that once tracked reindeer across open steppe now applies the same attentiveness to river fish runs. Seasonal nut harvests, migratory birds, forest game, or coastal tides. A social network once crucial for mate exchange across sparse cold territories now becomes a channel for spreading tools, styles, beliefs, and materials across newly habitable lands. The old glacial adaptations are not discarded, they are repurposed. In some places, this repurposing may happen with startling speed. Archaeological sequences show shifts in tool forms, raw material use, settlement choice, and symbolic expression that suggest people are not simply enduring environmental change passively. They are reorganizing their lives around it. Different regions move in different directions, some remain highly mobile. Others begin favoring repeated occupation of rich local zones. Some emphasize riverine and lacustrine resources. Others continue strong terrestrial hunting traditions for long periods. No single explanation fully accounts for all post-glacial pathways, because the environments themselves are too varied and the inherited cultural histories too distinct. What survives in the record suggests many futures emerging from one cold past. There is also a deeper legacy, harder to measure but perhaps more important than any one economic shift. The deep cold teaches human societies that landscapes are not permanent. Shores move, herds disappear, roots fail, forests advance, ice retreats. Entire ecosystems rise and vanish within spans long enough to shape memory, but short enough to demand response. A species that has lived through this learns, however unconsciously, to expect change. This may be one reason human communities prove so capable, over later prehistory, of occupying deserts, islands, high mountains, wetlands, forests, and coastlines, in combinations no other human lineage achieves at the same scale. The Ice Age does not merely test survival, it trains adaptability. The great recolonizations after glacial retreat also redraw the genetic map. Populations that had been isolated in refugia spread outward and meet others. Some lineages expand dramatically, others vanish. Ancient DNA has made clear that European and Eurasian prehistory after the last glacial maximum is not a simple story of one stable population diffusing evenly across empty land. It is a story of repeated movement, replacement, admixture, and regional turnover. The survivors remake the world not as a single undifferentiated humanity, but as many connected and diverging populations. The species remains one, yet its internal histories multiply. This, too, is part of the legacy of survival, not stasis, but branching. At the same time, the disappearance of the old cold giants leaves a permanent mark. The mammoth steppe fragments. Woolly mammoths retreat to a few late refugees before their final extinction. Woolly rhinoceroses vanish. Other great Ice Age animals decline or transform their ranges. Human beings continue without them, but not unchanged. The memory of a world in which giant herbivores dominate open plains is gradually replaced by a different ecological normal. Hunting strategies, symbolic worlds, seasonal assumptions, and even the emotional scale of landscape must all adjust. A child born well after the glacial maximum may inherit stories of wider plains, stranger beasts, and colder horizons that feel almost mythic. The world of ancestors becomes harder to imagine, even as its effects remain everywhere. One lesser-known but powerful consequence of glacial survival is the shaping of regional diversity. Because people endure the cold in many different refuges and ecological zones, and because they emerge from those zones along different paths, the post-glacial world is not culturally uniform. Distinct traditions, tool industries, subsistence patterns, and symbolic systems flourish in different places. In other words, the struggle to survive harsh climate does not flatten humanity into sameness. It helps generate later variety. Multiple successful solutions to Ice Age living become the roots of multiple later ways of being human. From this long perspective, the coldest period humans somehow lived through begins to look less like a dead end and more like a filter through which later humanity is shaped, not purified, not improved in any simplistic sense, but altered. The populations that persist are those able to cooperate under strain, learn quickly, move when necessary, maintain ties across distance, and treat knowledge as something worth carrying. These are precisely the traits that continue to matter long after the glaciers pull back. They will matter in forests and deserts, on islands and floodplains, in coasts, uplands, and river valleys, and eventually in the agricultural and urban world still far in the future. The old glacial earth leaves behind more than moraines and drowned shelves. It leaves behind a species tested by scarcity, motion, and uncertainty, and therefore unusually prepared for expansion into instability. That is why the survivors remake the world so effectively. They're not entering it innocent. They have already learned that no landscape stays fixed forever, and that endurance depends on responding before certainty fails completely. And yet the broadest lesson is still waiting. Once the recolonizations, adaptations, and inheritances are seen together, the story opens outward again. The coldest age is no longer only an environmental crisis or a chapter in prehistoric logistics. It becomes a mirror held up to the species itself. What kind of creature survives not just one bad winter, but an entire planetary regime of cold, contraction, and change. The answer lies not only in tools or migrations, but in the uneasy balance between fragility and resilience that has defined human life ever since. By the time the glaciers loosen their grip and the old cold world begins to dissolve into rising seas, forests, wetlands, and new human frontiers, one fact remains more unsettling than triumphant. Our species survives. Yes, but it survives in a way that strips away many comforting illusions. The coldest period humans somehow live through does not reveal a creature naturally suited to mastery. It reveals a creature repeatedly close to failure, repeatedly dependent on conditions outside its control, repeatedly saved by skills that are fragile because they live in memory, in cooperation, in shared labour, and in the willingness of small groups to keep carrying one another through landscapes that offer very little mercy. If there is a lesson in endurance here, it is not that humans are invincible. It is that humans are adaptive enough to remain present even when the world seems built to exclude them. That distinction matters. Invincibility suggests strength as a fixed possession. Adaptation suggests a constant act. Ice Age survival is never passive. It is sewn into clothing, fed into fire, walked into the right valley at the right season, remembered in the minds of elders, taught to children who must inherit knowledge before they fully understand the danger around them. The species does not possess survival the way a mammoth possesses fur. It manufactures survival collectively, then has to do it again the next day, and the next winter, and for generations so long that the great cold itself becomes normal. That may be the most astonishing feature of all. People do not merely endure an episode of unusual hardship, they build whole lives within it. Seen from the longest perspective, the glacial world also forces a harder understanding of human exceptionalism. The old temptation is to imagine that Homo sapiens survives because it is destined to, because intelligence naturally rises above climate, because our lineage somehow carries a built-in right to continuation. The Ice Age record offers no such reassurance. Other human lineages are intelligent. Other lineages know fire, tools, care, and cold landscapes. Some of them vanish anyway. Even within Homo sapiens, many groups likely disappear without descendants, without memorial, without any surviving record beyond a gap in the archaeological map. Survival belongs to the species in aggregate, but not to every population equally. The enduring human line is built from countless local losses. That is why fragility has to remain at the centre of the story. The human body is still vulnerable to cold. Human children are still born helpless. Hunger still weakens judgment. Small groups still break under misfortune. The climate still redraws maps without asking permission. Nothing about the Ice Age cancels these truths. What it changes is the scale at which human beings learn to answer them. One person cannot defeat glacial cold. A social species, carrying tools, memory, obligation, and symbolic cohesion, can sometimes outmaneuver it. The answer to environmental extremity is not individual heroism, it is collective persistence. And collective persistence leaves traces in the strangest places, in a needle, because someone needed clothing to fit tightly enough to keep out deadly air, in ochre, because meaning remained important even when calories were scarce, in a child's burial, because grief and care continued under a freezing sky, in distant stone transported across wide landscapes, because connection mattered more than isolation, in the bones of animals cracked for marrow, because no part of survival could be wasted, in the widening and narrowing of human genes, because populations contracted, met, mixed, and recovered, in drowned shelf worlds now lost under water, because people once walked where waves move today. In each of these details, endurance stops being an abstract virtue and becomes a measurable, embodied fact. There is also a warning in the story, though not a simple one. The Great Cold shows that humans are extraordinarily capable of adapting to severe environmental change, but it also shows that adaptation has costs, limits, and casualties. Entire ways of life can become obsolete when ecosystems shift. Successful knowledge can fail when the landscape that made it useful disappears. Populations can survive at the species level while vanishing locally. A changing world does not reward strength alone. It rewards responsiveness, cooperation, and luck. And even then, not always fairly. No single explanation fully accounts for who persists and who does not, because contingency is built into the human past from the beginning. Perhaps that is why the glacial story still feels so modern. Not because we live in an ice age, but because we still live inside environmental uncertainty, still depend on social systems more than we like to admit, still discover that our cleverness only matters if it can be shared widely enough to count. The people of the Great Cold are distant from us in technology, landscape, and daily experience, yet they are uncomfortably close in structure. They survive through networks, stored knowledge, flexible behavior, and the effort of keeping the vulnerable alive long enough for continuity to matter. In that sense, the oldest lesson in endurance is also one of the newest. Human resilience is real, but it is never solitary. The deeper image that remains is not one of conquest. It is one of presence. Across a planet of ice sheets, dust-laden winds, exposed shelves, mammoth grasslands, shrinking refuges, and unstable seasons, there are still people. They are watching weather. They are mending clothing. They are feeding fire. They are moving camp or deciding not to. They are following herds and burying their dead and teaching children the names of places that may not look the same by the time those children are grown. They are alive in conditions that seem to argue against their existence. And yet they remain there, not because the world relents, but because they continue answering it. In the end, that may be the clearest definition of our species the Ice Age leaves behind. Not the strongest animal, not the best armed, not the least vulnerable, the one that keeps reorganizing itself to stay, the one that turns memory into shelter, cooperation into warmth, movement into opportunity, and uncertainty into something survivable, if only just the one that can inherit a broken planet and still find a way, however narrow, through it. And once that is understood, the coldest period humans somehow live through becomes more than a prehistoric episode. It becomes a long test of what humanity really is when stripped of comfort, scale, and certainty. The answer is not glamorous. It is patient, social, improvised, and often precarious. But it is enough. Somehow, across the white silence and the bitter winds, across the shrinking margins and the vanishing worlds, it is enough to keep the fire lit. The ice does not remember them, at least not in the way humans remember. It keeps no names. It does not care which family crossed a white plain under a weak sun, which child survived one more winter because a fire held through the night, which hunters found the herd in time, which old person carried the map of a changing world only in memory. The cold preserves traces, but not stories. Those have to be imagined back from bone, ash, pollen, and the silence of drowned lands. And perhaps that is why this chapter of the human past lingers so powerfully. It feels close enough to recognize, yet distant enough to remain almost dreamlike. For a long time, the world itself seems larger than the people within it, ice towers at the edges of continents. Winds move over open steppe where mammoths pass like shadows from another creation. Rivers cut through frozen ground. Coasts lie far from where they are now. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that world begins to fade. The great cold loosens. The old plains drown. Forests advance. Herds change. The routes are rewritten, and still the people remain, carrying forward knowledge shaped by a planet that no longer exists. What survives from them is not only proof of endurance, but a certain human scale of persistence, a seam sewn tightly, a hearth rebuilt, a child protected, a body buried with care, a path remembered and taught again before the weather turns. The grand story of climate and extinction and shifting continents finally comes down to these smaller acts, repeated so often that they become history. Not history as monuments or kings or written names, but history in its older form, survival long enough for memory to pass into another mind. There is something humbling in that. The people who live through the deepest cold do not know they are preserving a future species. They are only trying to make it to the next season, the next hunt, the next thaw. Yet from those narrow efforts comes everything that follows. All later cities, empires, maps, books, and machines rest, very far in the distance, on worlds like this one, where human beings stayed alive in conditions that should have erased them. And so the last image is not of victory, but of quiet continuation, a dim fire in a shelter against the wind, fur and hide catching the light, beyond it, a vast night of ice, stars, and frozen ground stretching farther than sight. Somewhere out there, the old world is still moving, still changing, still dangerous. But within that small ring of warmth are people keeping one another alive, and that is enough. For now, and then for another night, and then for another generation, against the cold, against the silence, against the enormous indifference of the earth. That fragile persistence is what remains.